Okay. The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Today, we will discuss the dire need for comprehensive paid leave in the United States and the steps Congress can take to meet that need. In 2019, Congress passed my landmark legislation guaranteeing paid parental leave for the birth, adoption, or fostering of a child for more than 2 million federal employees. This was a huge step forward. There were only 2 countries in the world, the United States and Papua New Guinea, that did not provide at that time paid leave for the birth of a child. With the passage of this bill, it put the government in a strong position to recruit and retain a talented, diverse workforce. But we cannot rest now because there is much more work to be done. We need to build on this historic achievement by bringing the federal government's employment policies in line with leading companies in the private sector, and indeed the rest of the world. That's why in January, I introduced HR 564, the Comprehensive Paid Leave for Federal Employees Act. This bill would finally provide federal employees with comprehensive paid family and medical leave. That means employees would have access to paid leave if they get sick, need to care for an ill family member, or need to miss work due to family members' military deployment. The Family and Medical Leave Act guarantees unpaid leave for these reasons, but unpaid leave is untenable for too many federal workers. This is a policy that is long overdue for the federal workforce and for our nation. The federal government has the opportunity to lead the way on paid leave and fostering a family-friendly workplace. While providing access to paid parental leave was critically important and long overdue, it's just as important to provide access to paid family and medical leave too. Illnesses and military deployments are not events that can be planned for. As we've all learned in the past year, illness can strike any of us at any time. Is it fair, let me ask you, is it fair to ask workers to make an agonizing choice between caring for a family member or continuing to receive a paycheck? The answer clearly and unequivocally is no. These are choices that no one should have to make. The coronavirus pandemic has demonstrated dramatically and undeniably the need for paid family leave. Too many Americans lacked access to paid family leave during the pandemic, with devastating consequences. Expanding access to paid leave is a large part of a strong and equitable recovery. Just as importantly, after a year of global pandemic that has killed 600,000 Americans, why do we tolerate policies that actually create an incentive for workers to come to work sick because they cannot afford to take unpaid time off? Does anyone seriously believe that this is good public policy? Our committee has been working hard to fix these problems. We championed a provision of the American Rescue Plan that established a $570 million fund in the US Treasury to provide up to 15 weeks of paid coronavirus-related leave for all federal employees, including postal workers and others that are on the front line of providing services to Americans. This was an essential component of our nation's response to the pandemic. But paid leave is just as important for workers facing any kind of family health crisis. That's why we're proposing to take the necessary next steps by providing paid family and medical leave to all federal employees. Let's be clear, paid leave would benefit both workers and employers. You don't have to take my word for it. Today, we will hear from a small business employer on why this policy is in fact good for business. Employers in states that have adopted a paid leave program largely report that it is more convenient to administer and improves competitiveness. In fact, support for a national paid leave policy among both large and small businesses is quickly growing. The federal government, as the largest employer in the nation, can and must serve as an example in creating a family-friendly workplace. According to a 2018 survey by the National Partnership for Women and Families, 84% of Americans support paid family and medical leave, including large majorities of Democrats, independents, and Republicans. I have introduced versions of this bill since 2000, often with Republican support. This should be an issue that has the kind of bipartisan support in Washington that it has throughout the entire country. HR 564 is an investment in the people who keep the government running. We all have an interest in strengthening the federal workforce and making sure that the federal government is an employer that attracts and retains top talent. I am encouraged that President Biden and Vice President Harris have made universal paid leave a cornerstone of their ambitious American Families Plan. In addition to establishing a national paid leave program, the American Families Plan would make childcare more affordable, invest in early and post-secondary education, and make permanent tax credits that help working families, like the child tax credit. These provisions would build the infrastructure needed to bolster economic recovery and help American families. I look forward to working with my colleagues in Congress on both sides of the aisle to advance the administration's plan to help families emerge from the pandemic stronger and more financially secure for the future. The Comprehensive Paid Leave for Federal Employees Act is one piece of the vision the administration has laid out. It will strengthen the federal workforce over the long term, and it is a roadmap for the federal government to lead by example in creating a fair and safe workplace for American families. With that, I recognize the distinguished ranking member from the great state of Kentucky, Mr. Comer, for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Today's hearing, ironically, is titled Leading by Example. But this committee is holding the hearing remotely when we could walk down the hallway and meet in person to conduct committee business, just like Judiciary did last night, which is next door to the House Oversight Committee. Americans across the country are going back to work. DC restaurants are open at full capacity now. Cases have dramatically dropped across the nation, and members of Congress can all gather on the House floor at the same time. But this committee, under Democrat leadership, refuses to meet in person to do its work and instead hides behind computer screens. This goes against science. It goes against common sense. And this is not leading by example. Madam Chair, it's past time for the committee to do work in person, like just about every other committee in Washington. We do better work in person. We must lead by example and get back to normal operations, just like most Americans are expected to do. Moving on to today's committee hearing, Oversight Democrats have called a hearing on enhanced work perks for federal bureaucrats. That's right. More benefits for federal employees who already enjoy job security and lavish set of benefits not afforded to most American workers. This follows the Biden administration's recent announcement delaying the federal workforce's return to the workplace, despite most Americans being expected to show up for work. Meanwhile, hardworking Americans across the country are still recovering from the economic impacts of Democrat lockdowns, and our nation is facing many crises due to President Biden's disastrous policies. The Oversight Committee's time would be better spent focused on our committee's mission of identifying and preventing government waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement, and ensuring the government is transparent and accountable to the American people. Unlike Democrats, Republicans have been focused on fulfilling our committee's mission. On February 11th, 133 days ago, Republicans called for a hearing on massive unemployment fraud in California, where benefits were sent to murderers on death row, deceased individuals, and organized crime members in China and Russia. Chairwoman Maloney refused to hold a hearing on this gross mismanagement of taxpayer dollars. And now it's reported that $400 billion in pandemic assistance unemployment benefits were stolen, with as much as half the funds going to international crime organizations. Last week, Republicans called for a hearing on the heist of the century, but the chairwoman has not responded, unfortunately, to our hearing request. On February 24th, 124 days ago, Republicans called on Chairwoman Maloney to compel New York Governor Andrew Cuomo to testify under oath regarding his deadly order sending COVID positive patients to nursing homes and his subsequent cover-up. This is a gross abuse of power, and Governor Cuomo must be held accountable for his actions that resulted in the death of thousands of senior citizens. But have Democrats subpoenaed Governor Cuomo, let alone called a hearing on this issue? No. On February 25th, 123 days ago, Republicans called for a hearing on reopening America's schools. Ongoing virtual school has harmed students' well-being. Failing grades, mental health issues, and suicides are up across the board. Since we called for a hearing, we've learned that President Biden's CDC allowed a radical teachers union to interfere in its scientific guidance, effectively recommending 90% of schools remain shuttered. Now that the school year has ended and only about half of public schools finished up the school year fully in person, have Democrats held a hearing on this pressing issue, which threatens to set back a generation of kids? No. On March 4th, 112 days ago, Republicans called on Democrats to hold a hearing on President Biden's border crisis. We renewed our request 2 additional times since then. Since President Biden assumed office, masses of children have been held in overcrowded facilities during a pandemic and past the legal time frame. Apprehensions at the southwest border are at a 21-year high. The human smuggling industry is booming, and deadly drugs like fentanyl are pouring across our border. This is the very definition of government mismanagement and is ripe for congressional oversight. The Democrats held multiple hearings on conditions at the border and conducted several site visits to border facilities during the Trump administration. But now that a Democrat occupies the White House, crickets, nothing. On April 26, 59 days ago, Republicans called for a hearing on Mayor Bowser's solitary confinement of DC inmates. Under the excuse of pandemic precautions, inmates essentially have been held in universal solitary confinement as they're confined to their cells for 23 hours a day. This has resulted in severe effects on the inmates, including many sleeping at odd hours of the day, talking to themselves, others growing extensive beards and hair because the barbershops closed. This government abuse should be investigated, especially since it's happening in the district, which is under this committee's jurisdiction. But Democrats have failed to address this issue. On May 24th, Republicans called for an investigation into the Wuhan lab leak. There is evidence Communist China started the pandemic, covered it up, and is responsible for the deaths of almost 600,000 Americans and millions more worldwide. These questions are not a diversion, as Speaker Pelosi has stated. They get to the truth and accountability. And what is the Democrats' response? They're too busy investigating the Trump administration to have time to determine the origination of the COVID pandemic. And last week, Republicans called for a hearing on the massive leak of sensitive taxpayer information from the IRS. This committee has a history of conducting strong oversight over government officials at the IRS who abuse their position for political gain while thwarting congressional accountability and oversight. This committee must convene a hearing with Biden administration officials to understand who is responsible for these leaks of sensitive tax information. We must also determine what effects, if any, the administration is taking to prevent this from ever happening again. We are awaiting a response from the distinguished chairwoman. Madam Chair, it's past time for this committee to get back to its primary mission. We've already dramatically expanded paid leave for the federal workforce. Today's hearing to consider expanded paid leave even further for federal workers shows Democrats' priorities are incredibly distorted. The American people are concerned about the ongoing border crisis, abuses of power in government, getting their kids back to school, and the rising cost of goods and services. better known as inflation. We need to put the American people first, not the special interests of federal bureaucrats. I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair recognizes herself to respond to my dear friend and colleague from the other side of the aisle. I doubt that the women in the great state of Kentucky think that having a child is a quote perk. It is not a perk. And too many of us have been fired, thrown out of the room, told not to come back because you dared to have a child. Many women have sick children, and when they're sick, they need their mother. If your child is traumatized, if your child is sick, what's wrong with giving them paid leave to be there, to be with them? We both know that most women have to work. Most women have to work. Most families depend on two incomes. They can't make it on one income. I have federal employees call me asking, when is the bill going to pass so I can have a child? They can't even afford to have a child to take because they're going to be fired. They're not going to be paid when they're out with their child, and they need to be with their child in those critical first weeks of life. This is not a perk we're talking about. My brother was in Vietnam. When he was deployed, it was traumatic to his family. They would have liked to have been with him. They would have liked the time to adjust with 3 small children, but he was sent into the war zone. So, I mean, deployment of our military is serious business. It's not a perk. It's a crisis in most families. And what we're talking about is balanced policies that I will say that most countries in the world already have, even third world countries. We're the greatest country in the world. Can't we respect our workers? And I would like to respond to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that are always very protective of the private sector, and I am too. They're very important. They pay all the taxes for this country. But the private sector is far ahead of the public sector and how they treat their employees. They have in-building daycare centers. They have birthing, they have milking centers, they have support, they have paid leave, they have, working from your home leave. They have all of these things that the federal government does not have. And let me tell you, when I had my first child and went to personnel to talk about leave, they said, leave, we just want you to leave. I said, I don't want to leave. They said, you will be the first person in the history of this establishment that has had a baby and come back. I said, I am coming back. They said, well, you can apply for disability. I said, having a child is not a disability. It is a joy. It is a family value. It is something we should celebrate, not punish women for. We should celebrate them, give them the support that they so justly deserve in our society. We talk about family values. Where are they? My whole life, I have fought for balance between work and family because I suffered it in my own family. Only recently are people seriously talking about it. When President Biden announced it, I felt like I'd died and gone to heaven. That all of these issues that I had cared about, work-family balance, were being talked about seriously by the President of the United States. It is our job to try to implement them. And that is what we are doing today. And if you do a study comparing the private sector to the public sector, the private sector is doing a much better job in adjusting and really doing work-family balance within their companies. Most of them have paid leave. Most of them have on-campus daycare. Most of them have all kinds of services for their employees, and the federal government needs to keep pace. We know that we can't pay the same salary as the private sector. We know that. We have to find people that are committed to public service, but we also have to help them balance their families with the work that they have. I now recognize
Madam Chair, with all due respect,
Claiming my time.
no, Madam Chair, you went way over your time. You went way over your time. No, Madam Chair, what the Democrats don't understand, there are private sector employees too, and employers can't get people to come to work because
Regular order.
paying them not to work. You don't understand. There is a disconnect. You are living in.
Someone put the chair in order, please.
You don't
Will the chair restore order?
The taxpayers are sick and tired of giving more benefits and more perks to federal employees because they have to pay for those benefits and perks.
Madam Chairwoman,
And you want to raise their taxes even more.
parliamentary inquiry, Madam Chairwoman, am I recognized?
Mr. Conley, you are now recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the Chairwoman. And I thank the Chairwoman for holding this important hearing. And I add my voice to hers, how saddened I am at the diminution of this critical issue by the ranking member and all too many of his colleagues on the other side of the aisle, and the desire to distract us from the disastrous policies of the 4 Trump years, including, I might add, their management of the pandemic, which is nothing short of catastrophic and tragic and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. I guess the ranking member doesn't want us to remember that the President Trump, actually advised people to consider the ingestion of Clorox and other disinfectants.
Lie, that's a lie. And you know it.
Madam Chairwoman, I have the floor. You can shout lie all you want. That doesn't make it true. In fact, he did say that. It was publicly seen. So I'm saddened by the attempt to somehow distract us from the subject of this hearing. In fact, I was proud to hold the first hearing on this issue on your behalf, Madam Chairwoman, and proud to serve as an ally with you in the effort to renew our commitment to helping families meet the increasing demands of parenthood and family caregiving responsibilities. The Comprehensive Paid Leave of Federal Employees Act, HR 564, continues our committee's effort to support civil servants and their families. Paid family leave would ensure the federal government is the model instead of the laggard in protecting families and our employees who work so hard, especially during this pandemic, on behalf of the American people. They're not bureaucrats. They're dedicated public servants. In September 2019, our subcommittee
Madam Chairman, that time is expired.
Madam Chairwoman, I would ask a little indulgence because I had to seek recognition over the unrecognized.
Gentleman may finish. The gentleman may finish.
I thank the Chairwoman. And we were successful, but we made the victory lap short because there was more work to do. Today, we continue the fight for paid family caregiving leave and leave to care for one's own medical needs. The Comprehensive Paid Leave for Federal Employees Act would provide paid leave to federal employees for reasons that largely mirror the Family Medical Leave Act of 1993, to care for family, self, or other qualifying reasons that often surround active military duty. Data show that paid family
Madam Chairman, the gentleman is not finishing his sentence. He is continuing on, and the gentlewoman knows we're attempting to have regular order, not go through each and every person. And I would ask for 2 minutes when the gentleman does finish. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
The gentleman makes a good point. Mr. Conley, may we now move to Mr. Heiss, and I will give you as much time at the end of the hearing to complete every statement plus other time during the hearing.
Of course, Madam Chairwoman.
Okay. I now recognize Mr. Heiss for 2 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would just say too, it's time for us to meet in person. You cannot lead by fear, and other committees are meeting in person. We had natural resources in person yesterday. It's time that oversight leads by example itself. Republicans believe that federal employees should get the job done for the American people and that they should be held accountable for doing so. Under President Trump's executive orders, federal employees could be held accountable. That's what the American people deserve, and that's even what federal employees themselves want. Through his executive order on official time, he sought to ensure that federal employees actually did the job they were hired to do. How novel. Instead of doing what a union wants them to do. Democrats, on the other hand, seem to care less about these things. A key component of the Democrat return to work plan is to make sure as many federal employees as possible don't actually have to come back to work. What kind of a great idea is that? They are pushing permanent expanded telework without understanding what the impact has been, nor what it will be. I personally have asked IGs across federal agencies to conduct an assessment so that we could at least have some data on this. And now today, we're looking at ways to give federal employees even more time off on the backs of the American taxpayers. So Democrats' agenda for the federal workforce issues could be summarized as this. Here's the summary of the Democrats' plan. Come to work as little as possible, and when you do come, don't worry about doing your job. That's where we're headed with this thing. Congress just provided paid parental leave for federal workers, and now the majority is trying to expand paid leave for all categories in the Family Medical Leave Act. Combined with federal holidays and annual leave, federal employees now only have to work about 8 months out of the year. 8 months out of the year. Are you kidding me? This is absolute insanity. And this is what we're told is leading by example, getting where employees don't have to come to work for 4 months out of the year. The majority doesn't even know how much this program is going to cost. Oh, but I can tell you who is going to pay the cost. It would be the American taxpayer. But the majority doesn't even know the consequences of this. The Biden administration has released a tidal wave of wasteful and unnecessary pandemic aid that now threatens to swallow our country up in inflation and out of control spending. Meanwhile, here in this committee, it appears as though we're trying to create some sort of Gilligan's Island so that we can insulate federal workers from the issues that the rest of the world is facing. Madam Chair, I would agree that it is time to lead by example, both in having our meetings held in person, but also to have common sense to some of the issues that we bring as a topic of discussion for this committee. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We now will move to witnesses and introductions. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to recognize Mr. Welsh from the great state of Vermont to introduce Mr. Sorkin, who is a constituent of his.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very briefly, we're quite proud of our small businesses in Vermont. And I know that's true for Mr. Comer, my friend Pete Sessions. They're family affairs. And the folks who are going to testify, Eric Sorkin and his wife Laura, have run amok Maple. They have 75 employees, and they're taking maple syrup, and I'd like to share some with some of my colleagues. Theirs is fantastic. It's really helping the Vermont economy. They have 75 employees, and one of them had cancer. His wife had cancer. He couldn't leave work because he couldn't afford to lose the paycheck. And he was absolutely fearful about not having income. The Sorkins decided this doesn't work. This is like a family member. And you know what? I know in Georgia, in Texas, all around, we've got these small businesses where it's like a family. They started a family leave policy, and they were able to support at great expense to them this family leave to let that partner take care of his partner. So they're going to testify about this, and we need to help our small businesses where it's enormous financial pressure to deal with their commitment to their own employees who they regard as family. So I look forward to introducing Mr. Sorkin and working with the committee to see if we can make progress on family leave. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Welsh. Our next witness is Everett Kelly, who is the national president of the American Federation of Government Employees. Then we will hear from Vicki Szabo, who is a senior fellow for paid leave policy and strategy in the Better Life Lab at New America. We also have Hadley Heath Manning, who is the director of policy at the Independent Women's Forum. Finally, we will hear from Lelaine Bigelow, who is the interim vice president for economic justice and congressional relations at the National Partnership for Women and Families. The witnesses will be unmuted so we can swear them in, please. Please raise your right hands. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do. I do.
Let the record show that the witness answered in the affirmative. Thank you. Without objection, your written statements will be part of the record. With that, Mr. Kelly, you are now recognized for your testimony. Mr. Kelly.
Okay, I think I'm ready now. Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney, Ranking Member Comer, and the members of the committee. Now, I thank you for the opportunity to testify on the importance of comprehensive paid family leave. Today, I want to talk about the critical need for this benefit for federal workers and how it will improve recruitment, retention, and employee morale. I believe that caring for others is the very foundation of a federal employee's decision to serve the American public. AFGE represents federal employees who inspect the food we eat and places we work. They protect citizens from the illicit flow of drugs, maintain the safety of our nation's borders, care for our nation's veterans, serve as a vital link to Social Security recipients, and keep the national defense system prepared for any danger, protecting the flying public and respond to natural and man-made emergencies. We greatly appreciate Chairwoman Maloney for introducing the Comprehensive Paid Leave for Federal Employees Act to provide federal employees with 12 weeks of family leave for all instances covered under the Family and FMLA. No federal employee should ever have to choose between caring for a loved one and keeping his or her job. I've heard countless stories from AFG members who've had to make the choice between being able to support their families financially or supporting a loved one or taking care of themselves before they are ready to return to work. I've heard stories from VA nurses, civilian defense employees, correctional officers, Social Security claims adjusters, EPA attorneys, and meat inspectors that's caring for their elderly grandparents, their parents, children, and spouses. These hardworking civil servants provide care for loved ones suffering from Agent Orange exposure, cancer, traumatic brain injuries, and the consequences of accidents that no one saw coming. Opponents have raised objections to the cost of providing paid leave to federal employees. CBO last estimated the cost of the 2010 to 2014 period, so we don't know exactly how much it would cost today, but we estimate that it would be minimum compared to the cost of hiring and training new employees due to turnovers, due to lack of comprehensive benefits. Opponents also assert that federal employees already have enough paid leave and that they save it for emergencies or were more prudent in its use. It would be necessary to have paid family leave to their compensation. Now, these arguments miss the point entirely, of paid family leave. It is, unpredictability of the circumstances when paid family leave might become necessary. That is the reason for the benefit. Now, telling a federal employee not to use sick or annual leave because of the possibility of medical disaster striking a family member ignores the very serious and the reasons of paid annual and sick leave existing in the first place. If anyone doubted the value of paid sick leave prior to the pandemic, the risk to fellow workers of coming into work with a contagious disease should have changed their minds. COVID-19 is not the only virus that can spread at a workplace. It's clearly in the interest of any employer, especially an employer whose workers interact with the public, to allow workers to stay home when they are ill. Thus, using annual leave for rest and using sick leave for recuperation from illness would never be discouraged. Emergencies don't happen to only those with decades of employment and the opportunity to accumulate stores of paid leave. They happen to any and everybody. Federal employees are only able to accumulate a maximum of 30 days of annual leave, not enough time for other potential instances covered under FMLA. By most conservative estimates, it would take a federal worker who takes 2 weeks of annual leave and 3 weeks of sick leave per year, close to 5 years to accrue enough sick and annual leave to receive pay during the 12 weeks of family leave allowed under FMLA. Even if a federal worker never got sick and never went on vacation, it would take over 2 years to accumulate enough leave to pay for 12 weeks of family leave. Paid family leave would undoubtedly improve recruitment and retention of talented workers who might leave for other jobs that provide such leave. The federal government currently reimburses contractors and guarantees for the cost of providing, paid leave to their workers. Taxpayers are paying for this. If it's okay for contractors and those who get federal grants, it should be okay for federal employees. The COVID pandemic showed the critical need for paid leave for federal employees to be able to perform the mission of the agency and have time for dependent care needs. This concludes my statement. I will be happy to answer any question that you might have. And again, thank you for the time that you've given me today on this most important issue.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Ms. Shalbo, you are now recognized for your testimony.
Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney. Good morning. Special thanks to you for your tireless leadership on federal workers' paid leave and FMLA expansions over many, many years. And thanks to members of the committee who have engaged thoughtfully in dialogues about paid leave since the committee's last hearing in 2019. I'm Vicki Shabo, a senior fellow for paid leave policy and strategy at New America's Better Life Lab, though the views I express here are my own. The pandemic has shown us that we must do better in how public policies enable us to care for ourselves and one another. And it's underscored that universal paid leave is a must-have. Momentum toward expanding paid leave had been growing prior to the pandemic. Now 10 states have adopted paid leave programs, but there are still more than 100 million workers left behind. Just 1 in 5 private sector workers have access to paid family leave to care for a new child or a seriously ill loved one. Just 2 in 5 have access to employer-provided temporary disability insurance for a personal medical leave lasting weeks or months. For family leave, there are huge disparities. 38% of the highest wage workers, but just 5% of the lowest wage workers have access to paid family leave through their jobs. And access for those higher wage workers, while it has grown 20 percentage points in the last 10 years, for lower wage workers, it's only grown 2 percentage points. Too often, critics ask, how can we afford a national paid family and medical leave program? But I think the question we have to ask instead is, how can the country continue to bear enormous, unaffordable, and unsustainable costs of the status quo? Lack of paid leave costs a typical family more than $9,000. It reduces mothers' earnings. It means hundreds of thousands of dollars lost in older workers' earnings and retirement savings. For businesses, it means losing workers, absorbing costs of turnover, and for smaller businesses, difficulty competing for talent. For the economy, it contributes to $500 billion lost annually. Congress has made strides on paid leave in recent years, including the 12 weeks of paid parental leave for federal workers and temporary limited measures put in place for the pandemic. But now it's time for next steps. For federal workers, I urge you to enact the Comprehensive Paid Leave for Federal Employees Act to make the federal government a high-functioning employer of choice for 4 important groups of workers that will help make the federal workforce diverse and inclusive and contribute to better inputs and better outcomes. So first, younger workers. Parental leave alone is not enough to attract younger workers to replace the large numbers of federal employees who are at or approaching retirement age. Generation X, millennials, and Gen Z are all increasingly caring for older adults, and often for both children and older loved ones at the same time. Second, women and people of color both bear disproportionate caregiving responsibilities, often in multi-generational households. And the federal government has a lot of work to do to attract these workers to be public servants. Just 43% of federal workers are women, and workers of color are underrepresented at senior levels. Third, hiring people with disabilities is a stated goal of the federal government, and paid leave is a workplace benefit that most lack. It could help to distinguish the federal government as an employer of choice while also mitigating stigma. But we have to look beyond the federal government as an employer and focus on the federal government as an investor in people, businesses, and the economy. As we emerge from a deadly health crisis that has exacerbated gender, racial, and economic disparities and weakened the workforce, it's time for paid leave for all as a national priority. State paid family leave experiences show us the value we can expect from a well-crafted, well-implemented national paid leave plan. First, women's labor force participation, attachment, and increased earnings. Second, children's improved health and healthcare utilization. Third, men's greater engagement in the lives of children and families. Fourth, better health outcomes and reduced healthcare costs for ill, injured, or disabled people and more economic security for their caregivers. Fifth, savings to Medicaid, reduced need for SNAP and public assistance. And sixth, retention benefits for businesses, especially small businesses. The President's American Families Plan, the DeLauro Family Act, and Chairman Neal's Building an Economy for Families Act each propose public investments and paid leave for all working people, no matter where they live or work, their job, or their serious personal health or family care need. These proposals make available paid leave for everyone, comprehensive, neutral, gender equal paid leave with adequate wage replacement and an inclusive definition of family. Employers can do more. Nothing in these programs would limit their flexibility. Paid leave rewards work, it strengthens people's attachment to the workforce, and promotes employee retention. The plans under consideration would reduce a worker's losses by up to 85% compared to unpaid leave. National paid leave would boost GDP by up to $2.4 trillion by enabling more people to work, and would boost demands for goods and services by increasing household incomes. But at the end of the day, this is about values that unite us, like love, responsibility, dignity, and care. It's about being by the side of a loved one who's dying or recovering, seeing a baby's first smile, or getting the medical treatment you need without sacrificing the well-being of the family you love and support. Paid leave is not a pipe dream, it's not a luxury, and it's not a necessity. I look forward to working with you to make paid leave for all a reality. There is no time to waste, and I'm excited to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Sorkin, you are now recognized for your testimony. Mr. Sorkin.
Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney, Ranking Member Comer, and members of the committee for this opportunity. Thank you also, Congressman Welch, for the very generous introduction and for your steadfast support of small businesses throughout the pandemic. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today on the urgent need for robust public investment in care infrastructure, including paid family and medical leave. Thank you in particular, Chairwoman Maloney, for your strong leadership and commitment to expanding paid leave through the Comprehensive Paid Leave for Federal Employees Act. My name is Eric Sorkin, and together with my wife, Laura, we own and operate Run Amok Maple, a maple syrup manufacturing business with 75 employees in Fairfax, Vermont. I'm also speaking today as a member of Main Street Alliance, a national network of more than 30,000 small business owners. The importance of paid family and medical leave became crystal clear to me during our first few years in business. At the time, we had just about 10 employees. I had learned that the wife of one of our employees was losing a battle to terminal cancer. This happened in the middle of the sugaring season when the hours are long and unpredictable. Our employee had been coming into work in the middle of this terrible family ordeal because he wasn't in a position to miss a paycheck or risk losing his job. Put succinctly, he believed he couldn't afford to spend time with her, even though he desperately needed to. In that moment, without even realizing it, we launched our company's paid family and medical leave policy. We told our employee to take the time he needed to care for his wife, and we continued to pay him while he was out. Even with our small team, it wasn't a remotely hard decision. Nobody, least of all those in the most precarious financial positions, should have to choose between getting paid or taking care of loved ones or their health. Likewise, why do we embrace a system where small business owners feel as though they must choose between their own profitability and the well-being of their employees? It's a recipe for poor choices and bad outcomes on both sides. Since then, numerous members of our team have been out for extended illnesses, to care for loved ones, and for maternity leave. Just in the past few months, one of our longtime employees contracted viral meningitis and was out for weeks as he battled a persistent fever and delirium. Another employee was sexually assaulted and has struggled with her mental health since. The last thing either of them needs is the added worry over getting paid. Things happen and none of us can predict when. As business owners, we do everything we can to support our employees and hope that they want to do the same for us. While I personally believe that the return on paid leave is many times the expense, paying for family and medical leave is costly. The financial burden on our own business has been significant, particularly during the early years before we were profitable. Several times, including as recently as a year ago, we have looked into short-term disability insurance. We hope this might be a solution, but unfortunately, we found the policies available to companies of our size both inadequate and unaffordable. That's why I, along with many other Vermont small business owners, have been active in a state campaign to win paid family and medical leave. The idea is straightforward. We set aside a few dollars each week per employee into a fund. Then when an employee goes out on leave, the fund then pays that employee's salary. In return, as an employer, I have their salary to hire a replacement worker or cover overtime. A solution such as this would be a huge improvement over the current system, where we face unpredictable and sharp cost hikes when someone goes out on leave. A majority of small business owners across the political spectrum support a public solution, and that support remains high after paid leave programs have been implemented in those states. If we didn't know it before COVID brought the point home, as a business, prioritizing employee safety goes hand in hand with protecting our business and the health of our community. Speaking for my business, the challenges were quite significant, and about 80% of our frontline workers needed time off during COVID, either to quarantine or to recover. As a small company, absorbing all those costs in such a short period of time would have been a tremendous challenge. The passage of the federally enacted Families First Coronavirus Response Act was extremely helpful to our company as we navigated COVID. The legislation made what could have been tough decisions easy and was critical to our business during this time. Doing the right thing as a small business owner should always be this easy. Asking us to cover these expenses out of pocket is really asking for quite a lot. And the alternative, asking for workers to go without coverage, is simply no solution at all. America is a nation made up of small businesses and those who work for them. By creating a national paid leave solution, we would create a more level playing field for workers and all of our small business owners. As Congress considers a long-term economic infrastructure and recovery package, a national permanent paid leave policy and program must be a priority. Paid leave is not just what small business employees deserve, it is vital to keeping our entire community safe and our economy resilient. Thank you for your time and attention. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Ms. Manning, you are now recognized for your testimony.
Thank you. My name is Hadley Heath Manning, and I'm Director of Policy for Independent Women's Forum, and I'm a Senior Blankley Fellow at the Steamboat Institute. I'm also the mother of 3 young children, and I've taken 3 paid maternity leaves in the last 5 years, so I certainly personally appreciate the importance of this issue. In my role at IWF, I also manage a group of female employees. We frequently have staffers out on maternity leave, so I understand how this issue impacts employers as well. Expanding access to paid family and medical leave is a noble goal, a goal that I support, but the real question is how. Lawmakers should keep in mind that the government is in some ways a unique employer and should not serve as a model for all private sector employers who are diverse in size, industry, labor force, and resources. The government can increase taxes or use deficit spending to fund new benefits for employees. Private sector employers cannot. Many American businesses suffered or shuttered as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and are still struggling to recover, if they will at all. Those businesses are not contemplating a vast expansion of benefits for their employees because they simply lack the resources. It would do those private businesses more harm than good at this moment to require that in order to open their doors or create new jobs, they must offer a generous, comprehensive paid leave benefit to follow the model set by this proposed legislation. The trend towards better access to paid leave in the United States actually tracks closely with economic trends. At the height of the pre-pandemic economy, more and more US employers were offering paid leave as a way to attract and retain workers in a tight labor market. One question for lawmakers to consider today is whether the federal government now, as an employer, needs to enhance the compensation and benefits it offers in order to compete for labor. If the answer is no, then to offer greater benefits than necessary is simply poor stewardship of taxpayer dollars. In reality, the federal workforce already has access to more benefits than private sector workers. And on average, federal employees are compensated better. The average salary among federal workers is $85,000. This is significantly greater than the median total household income for the general US population. Over 50% of employees have a bachelor's degree or higher compared to 36% in the general population. This means that the Comprehensive Paid Leave for Federal Employees Act would be taxing a relatively less resourced general population to provide special and perhaps unnecessary benefits for federal workers, an already relatively privileged group. Similarly, other proposed legislation like the Family Act would create a national paid leave entitlement and would also exacerbate income inequality. Government paid family and medical leave programs have been shown to distribute money from low-income workers to those with higher incomes. Studies from California, New Jersey, Canada, Sweden, Iceland, Belgium, and Norway have demonstrated this. And as scholars concluded in Norway, these programs constitute a, quote, pure leisure transfer to middle and income families at the expense of some of the least well-off in society, end quote. This is regressive, not progressive. Given that the problem of a lack of paid family and medical leave is most pronounced among low-income people, lawmakers should not establish a program or policy that disadvantages this group further. Another potential downside of comprehensive paid leave benefits for the federal workforce and beyond is that this benefit may actually create an incentive for discrimination against certain groups, including women, elderly workers, and workers with significant medical issues, because these groups are more likely to take advantage of those leave benefits, and employers know this. Pew Research has, in fact, documented the strong positive correlation between more generous paid family medical leave and wider gender pay gaps in 16 OECD countries. Finally, we must consider costs. Sadly, so far, there's been no cost estimate for the Comprehensive Paid Leave for Federal Employees Act. But in addition to the hard costs to taxpayers, the federal government will face other costs when workers are not present at their jobs while they're using the new benefits that are offered in this proposed legislation. While we all want workers with family and medical emergencies to have the option to take time away from work, the flip side for employers is increased absenteeism and turnover. Employers and fellow employees alike will take on the burden of covering for workers who are out on leave, or in the case of the federal government, the institution that we all rely on to do the people's work may become slower, less efficient, and less responsive to the citizens that it serves. The government is unlike other employers in many ways, which is why it should not be the model for comprehensive paid family leave. Rather than instituting a one-size-fits-all universal policy, lawmakers should focus any government intervention on helping those who need support most, while otherwise allowing businesses and employees to continue to find their own personalized solutions that work best for them. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. Ms. Bigelow, you are now recognized for your testimony.
Good morning, Chairwoman Maloney, Ranking Member Comer, and members of the committee. My name is Lelaine Bigelow, and I'm the Interim Vice President for Economic Justice and Congressional Relations at the National Partnership for Women and Families. I'm pleased to join you to discuss the importance of paid leave for federal employees, including congressional employees. And this issue is deeply personal for me, having spent more than a decade working in the administration and in Congress. Growing up from modest means, I came to understand the importance of access to paid leave when I was just 16, working at a family restaurant in Pensacola, Florida. I was surrounded by hardworking moms who were servers, and there was one in particular, Tony, who left a mark on me. When we didn't have a lot of diners, Tony would tell her story about how she went into labor at the restaurant, then went across the street to the hospital, delivered her baby, and was back the next day for the Sunday morning rush. People would nod their heads in admiration, but even then, I knew Tony was faced with an impossible choice: losing her job and her paycheck, or caring for herself and her family. So in January of 2013, when my husband and I discovered I was pregnant, we felt excited and scared. I was working at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and he was employed by the House of Representatives. I recalled Tony's story and knew that I wanted to take the full 12 weeks of time off allowed under the FMLA to bond, recover, and acclimate to parenthood. At the time, the federal government did not have a paid leave policy. You had to take time off without pay or use your accrued leave if you had enough available. Complicating matters, in May, we found out that I had an incompetent cervix, and I was immediately put on bed rest for the next 4 months. Thankfully, I was given a pregnancy accommodation that allowed me to work from home while on bed rest. At the time, this was unusual, and because it felt like a privilege, I worked extra hard throughout my difficult pregnancy to avoid the appearance that I was taking advantage of the situation. But the diagnosis meant I needed to go to the doctor every week and a specialist every few weeks, requiring more time off of work. Taking an hour or two each week for doctor's appointments chipped away at the time that I was trying to save. Plus, I was sent to the hospital twice, which eroded my time off even more. It was stressful, and I was desperate to make up time, even in the hospital. I answered emails and made phone calls because every moment I spent caring for myself and my pregnancy meant losing money and time later. Like so many women of color, I faced the challenge of navigating pregnancy health complications without the paid leave I needed to care for myself and my family. Despite our best efforts, in July, my son Jack was born 6 weeks prematurely and was immediately brought to the NICU, the Neonatal Intensive Care Unit. That same day, the Transportation HUD Appropriations Bill was on the Senate floor, a bill I'd been following for my team at HUD prior to the birth. I kept responding to emails that morning because I didn't know how long Jack would be in the NICU, and I knew this was one more day with a paycheck. In the end,
Audio test to the hearing room. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4.
Quick update, we're just resetting the timer and should be able to start.
The committee will come to order. I apologize. This was a throughout the entire system in Congress. We are now reconvening. Thank you, and I now recognize myself for 5 minutes and for questions. Democrats have been fighting for years for comprehensive paid family and medical leave. I was proud to vote for the Family and Medical Leave Act in 1994, which granted 12 weeks of unpaid leave so that people wouldn't be fired for having a child. Shortly afterwards, with then Senator Joe Biden, Rosa DeLauro, and others, we started working for paid leave. I am very proud of the work that the core committee did in the successful passage of paid parental leave for federal employees in 2019. But over the last year, we've seen that countless families continue to suffer because our nation still has no nationwide paid family and medical leave policy. President Biden and Vice President Harris have put forward the American Families Plan, which includes an historic investment in universal paid leave for every American family. Ms. Chabot, why is a nationwide paid leave policy important to the pandemic recovery? How will it help American families for the future?
Thank you so much for the question, Chairwoman Maloney. You know, we saw throughout the pandemic the enormous numbers of people who left the workforce because of caregiving responsibilities and for health needs. Some of that had to do with children who were unexpectedly out of school or care. Some of it had to do with caring for older adults or loved ones who needed care. Some of it had to do with the personal health consequences of COVID-19 itself. We needed paid leave long before the pandemic. We urgently need paid leave coming out of the pandemic. But the pandemic brought into sharp relief, in particular, the connection between the gendered nature of caregiving and workforce participation. You know, we have nearly 2 million women who are still out of the workforce, many of them because of caregiving. This is an unsustainable phenomenon. It will take women more than a year to get back to workforce participation levels of before the pandemic. This is one intervention that will help that, but more than that, help create a stronger and more inclusive workforce for women, for people of color, for people with disabilities, for families that are multi-generational for a long time to come.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly, would you agree that a permanent expansion of paid leave to all federal employees beyond parental leave will help strengthen the federal workforce? You unmute, please.
Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney. I certainly agree with that because, you know, and I said this before, you know, one of the major problems I think that the federal government have is that they don't offer a good benefits package in order to keep and retain, you know, federal employees. So they'll go other places because, you know, other places will offer these benefits. So it's so important that we do that.
Okay. My bill, the Comprehensive Paid Leave for Federal Employees Act, builds on paid parental leave for federal employees that was implemented last October. The bill will ensure that federal employees have access to paid leave in the event of a personal or family emergency or military deployment of a family member. Ms. Bigelow, can you explain why all workers and families need this kind of comprehensive paid leave? Ms. Bigelow. Ms. Bigelow. Well, she's having difficulty. As we've also heard, a comprehensive paid family and medical leave program is good for business. Mr. Sorkin, you discussed the reasons why you made the decision to offer paid family and medical leave to your employees. How would a comprehensive national paid leave program help small businesses like yours?
Thank you, Chairwoman. I appreciate the opportunity to respond. Well, currently the burden falls directly on business owners and employees to come up with a makeshift solution. Either way, that ends up being costly, uncertain, and uneven. A national pay leave program would offer predictability and peace of mind, and it would also level the playing field between big and small businesses.
Thank you. And just in closing, the Biden-Harris administration and Democrats in Congress will continue to work to enact paid family and medical leave for all employees in the federal government and the private sector. I urge my Republican colleagues to work with us to make paid family and medical leave a reality for American families in our country. I now yield to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman. Mr. Norman, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Maloney. You know, I am really shocked at this, at even having this hearing. This is, I think Clay Higgins said a three-ring circus. This is an insult to the American taxpayer. Here's the words I've heard from some of our witnesses: love, caring, caregiving. Ms. Maloney, I think you mentioned, one of the witnesses mentioned strengthening the federal workforce. You know, I don't have to tell anybody listen to this hearing. You know, our cities are burning, our police forces are being decimated because they're being defunded by this administration. Crime is, our shootings are up. Illegals are coming across the border. One of the witnesses mentioned protecting our borders. We've got cartels that are making up $500 million a month. We've got the administration that won't even go down there. Our businesses have been shut down for 1.5 years. Workers, we can't get workers. When you go to McDonald's that I did and got put on a limit to buy because $13 because they had 2 people in the store, they couldn't get people to come back. Lumber prices are up 400%, and we're having a hearing on paying people, federal workers, 4 months to work. This is an insult to the taxpayer. It really is. Who's going to pay for this? We don't even have a CBO score. We didn't even have the courage to have a CBO score. 30 trillion in debt. Where is the caring for our small businesses that are lifeblood? I don't need to tell anybody, the federal government needs to be cut. People want to get the federal government out of our lives, not in more of our lives. And what this administration is doing, particularly with the 2 million illegals coming into the country, is expanding the federal government. Why don't you just let them, you know, what's 4 months, go and put 6 months off. I can tell you one thing, the small businesses don't get 6 months off. I can tell you one thing, that the small businesses that support the federal government, this is a backbreaker, along with the taxes that are that this administration is proposing. It's not your money. It's not the politicians got it wrong. It's not y'all's money. It's the people's money. And I'm sick and tired of this charade that we're having. Ms. Maloney, I like you as a person. We've asked you time and time again to have hearings on inflation. What are we going to do to solve problems? Let's have a hearing on let's pay the police maybe for a change instead of the criminals. And here we are wasting time, not even letting us come to let us come to the hearing room when we had a guy in a wheelchair that showed up. This is really an insult to everybody, particularly the taxpayers. The taxpayers deserve better than this. And where are the priorities? With this country in the shape we're in, where are the priorities? And we're having a hearing on paying people more money to stay out of work. The states form the federal government, not vice versa. They work for us, not vice versa. So, you know, I really don't have any questions for the rehearsed responses from our witnesses. I guess thank you for coming, but you know, this is a complete waste of time. But thank you anyway, and I guess we'll carry on with the hearing. I yield the balance.
Hi, the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton, is recognized. Mrs. Norton.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. This is an important hearing for a number of reasons. I particularly appreciate that you are having this early hearing now, because this bill has been in effect for 9 months. So this is the time to look to see if it has made any difference. And it makes a difference that the federal government was first. We ought to lead the way for the private sector. In fact, it looks like they are leading the way in many ways But for the federal government to lead the way to show that it works or doesn't work is exactly what we needed. And this hearing enables us to see, well, does it work or not? That's why my first question is for Mr. Kelly. Now, we're 9 months in, Mr. Kelly, to this bill. Just the time to kind of look back almost a year since it was passed to see how it has affected federal employees. I know it's early, but it would help to know, you've already said that it affected employee morale. But can you tell us, has it affected, for example, retention? Do we know this early whether it affects retention at a time we know that people are looking for workers and we wouldn't want to lose experienced federal workers? Do we have any information on that at this time?
Thank you, Representative Norton. I can't say that we have any concrete documentation as far as retention. But what I will tell you is that we have had so many employees to utilize these opportunities, you know, until it's insurmountable. We can't tell you how much people have appreciated having this. And I think that it will have a positive impact on retention because employees are grateful for the bill that was passed to give them the opportunity to use this leave, you know, which is vastly different and equally important to the one that has been proposed now. Okay, so I hope that answers your question, madam.
Well, I can understand it's early to know. I hope that your union will find a way to see what the effect is. It's also the federal government should do that. And I know that importantly, this bill affects adoption and fostering a child as well. Something that is very important to parenting at this time. Ms. Chabot, why is paid parental leave not enough to support workers and their families?
Thank you so much for the question, Representative Norton. So parental leave is used when we look at the unpaid leave under the FMLA. Parental leave is about 1/4 of the time people that take FMLA leave. About 1/5 are for caring for an older loved one or a person with disability, a family member, and about 1/2 is for a worker's own serious health issue. So most FMLA leaves are to care for yourself or to care for a loved one. This will only be exacerbated as the population shifts. We have an older population now. We have fewer people who are available, fewer family members available to care for older loved ones because of the mismatch in population sizes. So care for yourself, care for a loved one, very, very critical and will become more so over time.
Thank you very much. That's important to know. Madam Chair, this has been an important hearing and you have conducted it, I think, appropriately at a time when we can begin to measure its effect. It's a first step. And I thank you very much for this hearing, allowing us to monitor where we are now. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Cloud, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you for holding this hearing and giving us an opportunity to speak into these issues. I would like to echo the ranking member's sentiments on the importance of having, or at least these hearings being available in person. If nothing else, the tech challenges we've experienced today, I think echo just how important that is. I would like to talk really about what's going on in this committee, first of all, and that is we're supposed to be the oversight committee. That means our essential job is to ensure that the taxpayers' dollars are being used effectively. We're to make sure we weed out waste, fraud, and abuse. Currently, we have a border crisis going on with hundreds of millions of dollars going out, often in no bid contracts. That's worth looking into. We have economic and an inflation crisis that's worth looking into. We have unemployment benefits fraud. It's been estimated, some reports say that nearly
half of the unemployment benefits doled out by the government have been stolen by criminals. It's estimated that amount of fraud could be as high as $400 billion, which would be the largest, my understanding is the largest case of fraud in our nation's history. We have the China COVID origins that we should be looking into. We have cyber attacks. These are real existential threats to our nation and certainly the preeminence we've enjoyed on the world stage. And so we need to be able to address these things. I'd encourage the committee to be able to take these up. This is extremely important for us to fulfill our essential duty. I appreciated the chairwoman's passion about the private sector and federal civilian workforce. If only the data backed it up, that would be something. But federal data from the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis in 2018 said the federal civilian workforce had an average wage of over 94,000. Where the average for the private sector was about 63,000. And so the notion that the federal workforce right now is lagging behind the private workforce that is funding the federal workforce just doesn't stand up to the available data. And I would just say that right now is really the wrong time as we're working to recover from the economy. Right now, our offices deal daily with casework. And one of the big issues that we're dealing with right now is FSA offices. Farmers are having trouble getting their claims processed, their applications processed. Veterans, we're dealing with the VA benefits processing that is woefully behind. The passport expedited process is now weeks long. The IRS is hopelessly backlogged. And so all this at a time where we have some very good federal workers who are continuing to work and do their due diligence, but a number of them, in the words of our constituents, are not working. And it's been very difficult to keep up with the pace of supporting and serving the people who've elected us to serve them. But I want to touch on what is really kind of the heart of this issue, is that politicians sometimes get away with this idea that we can measure our personal compassion by how much of other people's money we give away. And that is really a flawed sentiment, because truly everyone on this issue wants families to prosper. We want families to be taken care of. We want moms to be taken care of. We want adoptive parents to be taken care of, all these kind of things. The question is how do we create a sustainable model that meets the needs, but doesn't steal opportunity from the next generation? And so we have a couple different models. The Democratic model has been to put a heavy burden on the American taxpayer, often with deficit spending, as we are $30 trillion in debt, stealing from the next generation's opportunities to have these same sort of benefits, which is, I think, questionably moral. So we need to meet the needs and obligations of this generation with this generation's resources. And so one model that does work, and what we were seeing working, is the organic approach, and that is for us to have a thriving economy, where just a year and a half ago we saw wages increasing, and because of that we had a competitive workforce, and employers had the economic wherewithal, because we had a booming economy, to create a competitive workforce to begin to offer these sort of services in a sustainable model. That is a sustainable model that provides increased benefits over time without burdening the next generation. So the important thing is that we realize that the heart of what we're trying to accomplish is great, but there's a way to go about it. Too often we see the government coming in and creating problems before stepping in to try to solve them. We see that with the latest crime spree. We see that with the economic issues that are happening right now. So let's have a better approach to these issues and let the American people do the great work that they are so awesome at doing. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley, is now recognized. Mr. Conley.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you for holding this hearing. The federal workforce is aging. Think about this. 20% of the private sector workforce is under the age of 30. Only 7% of the federal workforce is under 30. As of April of this year, 300,000 federal employees are eligible to retire. That's 13.5% of the entire federal workforce. Within 5 years, that number will go from 13.5% to 30%, almost 600,000 federal employees. Ms. Shabo, am I pronouncing that right, Shabo?
Yes, you are.
You testified that comprehensive paid family and medical leave for federal employees will help attract and retain the workforce of the future, both diverse and more inclusive and younger. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that? Because we talk about it like it's a nice thing to do, and I don't know, but actually from a practical point of view, how are we going to attract younger workers who will come to expect these kinds of provisions in the private sector, as the chairwoman pointed out earlier in this hearing, when we're not doing it in the public sector?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I think the answer has two parts. One, with all respect to the chairwoman, I do want to just reiterate that the private sector is not doing great for most workers. It's doing okay for high wage workers and some of the same workers that would be equivalent to the federal workforce in terms of more educated, higher skilled, higher paid. It's not doing great for middle income and lower wage workers. Again, just 5% of low wage workers have access to paid family leave, and that's only increased by 2 percentage points in the last 10 years. So those private sector workers are not doing great. However, all workers, many workers, 53 million workers are caregivers to older adults or to children with special needs. 11 million workers are caring for both a child and an adult who has a disability or an illness or an injury. More than half of those are millennials. Another 25% or so are Gen X. 6% are Gen Z. So as we think about building the kinds of workplaces that meet the needs of younger workers, who, by the way, also expect these care responsibilities to continue for at least 5 years, maybe longer, we have to put in place workplace policies, both in the public sector, for sure, as the federal government as an employer, but also in the private sector for workers overall. This is why we need both paid leave benefits in the federal workforce that help to attract workers, but it's also why we need a paid leave baseline for everybody. This is an economic competitiveness issue for the country, as well as a diversity and inclusion issue.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly, from your vantage point, what about that? I mean, how are we going to recruit and retain the workforce of the future from your point of view if we're not addressing issues such as the one that is the subject of this hearing today?
And I really appreciate that question, because we have to address these issues, right? Because unless we forget that, COVID-19 taught us a lot. It taught us that, now is the time for us to address family issues, because what we saw so many families struggling to take care of their families during the COVID-19 issues. And it's more and more prevalent, and we're going to see more and more of it. I'm going to give you just an example, not necessarily dealing with COVID, but I just know of a member of our organization, right? A single mother, in the state of Alabama, had a son that was kind of hanging out with some of the wrong people, right? Got himself in some trouble, doing some things that he shouldn't have been done. And the boys that he thought was his friends, actually got him high on marijuana and hung him, okay? He ended up being paralyzed, and his mother had to be home to take care of him. His mother almost lost her job as a result of it, because she used all of her leave, and therefore they were proposing to dismiss her because of her abuse of leave. She wasn't abusing leave. She was trying to take care of her son. She was the only family member that he had to take care of her. And so, but because we was able to save her job is the only reason why she didn't have to go in bankruptcy. She didn't lose her home and all the types of things. And there are numbers of stories like that that tell us that this is the right time to have this discussion.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman, is recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Grothman.
There. We'll start off with Ms. Manning. Last week, we passed a bill, which I voted for, but I had some misgivings because we were adding another, paid day off for federal employees that I don't think is going to be reciprocated in the private sector by the vast majority of employers. By my account, when one adds together the 12 weeks of paid leave that this benefit would provide, 12 paid holidays, and 20 days of paid vacation, 13 days of paid sick leave, we get up to about 4 months of paid leave for federal employees. Could you compare that to kind of what's going on in the private sector here, Ms. Manning?
Sure, and a lot depends on how benefits are qualified or measured, but the Bureau of Labor Statistics does keep track of how many private sector full-time and part-time workers have access to different types of paid time off. And so while it is true that nearly 90% of full-time workers in the private sector have access to paid vacation time or paid leave of some type, the reality is that when you start to talk specifically about benefits that are quantified or qualified as paid family leave, it's a much lower number. So about 1 in 5 private sector workers who are full-time, and only 5% of part-time workers have access to paid family leave. And then if you want to get industry specific, which I think is helpful when you start to think about the competitiveness of the federal government as an employer, 37% of workers in the finance and insurance sector have access to paid family leave, 33% in the information industry sector, 27% in professional, scientific, and technical services. And so the point of this is to say, not even half of workers in some of the highest paying fields have access to this type of family and medical leave. So I don't know that it's justifiable for the federal government to say, we need 12 weeks of paid leave for any FMLA qualified leave reason in order to be competitive. That's simply not where the private sector is. Of course, if you look at companies, specific companies like Netflix or the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that are really at the tip of the spear leading with the most generous types of paid family and medical leave, you could say that the federal government isn't keeping up with those employers. But when you look at the average or you look at the portions of different industries, it's just not the industry standard to offer 12 weeks of paid time off.
Will this have any unintended consequences for the guys who pay the bills, the private sector?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's, maybe one misperception I'd like to dispel, if I may, is that the current leading proposal to establish a comprehensive national paid leave entitlement would be paid for with a new payroll tax. And you can establish a payroll tax on employers, but the CBO recognizes, as do most economists, that a new tax on employers is simply passed along to employees in the form of lower wages. And so we're talking about not just increased taxation costs, but lower wages as a result, fewer economic opportunities, fewer new jobs. That's simply the reality. When you raise the cost of employment, you get less employment. And so I think it's a misperception to say that only businesses or only employers will bear the costs of comprehensive paid leave policies, at least the most popular or leading proposals that Democrats have advanced, like the Family Act. There are other proposals that I'd be happy to talk about that come with less downside, fewer trade-offs, better individual choice for workers and lower costs for taxpayers. But if we're talking about establishing a new national paid leave entitlement, the cost will be borne by workers and disproportionately by low-income workers, because that's how regressive payroll taxes work.
Okay, just a general question for any of you. I know we've dealt with the post office in this hearing otherwise, always in financial straits. Does anybody have any estimates on what the cost here will be to the Postal Service? Nobody has thought of that. Okay, next question. Has anybody thought about the effect it'll have on the ability of the post office as people take off to deliver mail effectively on a timely basis? I mean, we have such a shortage of people doing work of any sort in this country right now. Anybody thought that through? Anybody on the panel? Okay, something else I think we should think about before we move ahead with this bill. Do you feel the federal government is the best place to test out this big expansion, in your opinion, Ms. Manning?
So as I indicated in my testimony, I think that, just like any other employer, the federal government has to set their policies related to HR and compensation and so forth. But I do not think that the federal government is a model for other employers in the nation. The private sector is different in important ways. As taxpayers, we have a stake in how federal government resources are used. That's a stake that I don't have in some of the ways that other companies choose to operate or choose to compensate their employees. So I really feel that the federal government is a unique employer and shouldn't be used as sort of the model for other employers.
Okay.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman's time has expired.
Okay, well, thank you for
the
5 minutes.
Thank you. The gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, is recognized. 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, thank you very much for calling this really important hearing. Paid family medical leave is a fixture in advanced countries around the world, and I think a lot of them look at America with some shock and scandal that the wealthiest country on earth does not provide paid family medical leave, both for public sector and private sector employees. And obviously, there's a campaign going on against paid family medical leave for workers in either the public and private sector. And I think another piece of bitter fruit of that campaign is trying to pit public and private workers against each other, as if public school teachers and letter carriers aren't married to people who are small business people and engineers. The public sector and the private sector are intertwined. And in America, the federal government is actually the largest employer with 2.6 million employees. Tens of thousands of them live in my district. These are hardworking, patriotic people who are running and working in every department, from the Park Service Interior Department to the Department of Defense to the Department of Justice. They're the people who make it possible for the country to operate, because we need government in order to make society work. And unless there are any anarchists out there or Antifa members on the panel, I think everybody has got to agree that we need government. So I think some of the attacks on government workers are really improper and sound very antiquated and obsolete to me. But in any event, 85% of federal workers don't live in the DC area. They live across the country, and they're doing the work, whether it's for the Department of Agriculture or the Department of Commerce or Homeland Security, all over America. And we have them in all of our states and all of our districts. But I want to ask Ms. Szabo, I hope I'm pronouncing your last name right. I want to ask you about the public health dimension of this, because we went through this discussion in Maryland when I was a member of the General Assembly. And one of the things that became very clear to us, Democrats and Republicans and independents alike, is that we don't want people going to work when they're sick. And you would think that COVID-19 would have taught us that. That there's a new report that just came out about the teams of doctors that President Trump had to take care of him to save him from COVID-19 when he had rushed heedlessly into going out without a mask and telling everybody it would magically disappear and just use hydroxychloroquine and all that nonsense. But he had teams of government lawyers working on him to try to rescue him from his own folly and recklessness. Most Americans don't have that. So if somebody gets sick, don't we want them to stay home? I mean, do we really want to create a financial incentive for them to go to work and spread whatever it is they have?
Absolutely not. Thank you for bringing this up, Congressman Raskin. And Maryland has been a leader on paid sick days. Congress was smart at the beginning of the pandemic to implement the Families Coronavirus Response Act, which, though limited in terms of its scope and who it applied to, impacted the contagion of COVID-19 and is estimated to have prevented 15,000 COVID cases per day nationwide. So that alone speaks to the importance of time to stay home and to recover and to keep yourself and your family and your workplace safe. But more than that, as we think about the need for paid family leave and paid medical leave, there are now untold numbers of long-haul COVID survivors. About 25% of them are expected to have symptoms, chronic, intermittent, other symptoms that continue. We need both paid sick time and we need paid medical leave for longer-term serious health conditions. Research shows that when people have access to paid leave, they come back to work more quickly, they're more productive. This is good for them, obviously, for their family and for their employer. In terms
Thank you so much, Ms. Shea. But Mr. Sorkin, let me turn to you. I have two quick questions for you. One is, are you aware of other businesses in your industry that also pay people paid family and medical leave? And I think there's some suggestion that American workers in the private sector, public sector will cheat. If they've got paid family and medical leave, they will invent sicknesses. They'll pretend somebody's got cancer. They'll pretend somebody's got leukemia. They'll fake it. Like we're a nation of con men or con women. But has that been your experience? Tell us honestly, are people like rigging the system and ripping you off?
Well, to answer the first question, thank you, Congressman. But to answer the first question, other small businesses like mine, it's very unusual to find small businesses that are willing to absorb the expense. In my experience, we have not seen people abusing the system. I think it accounts even, it's less than 1% or 2% of our payroll, and consistently less. And particularly in a small business, we know our employees, and that kind of abuse just doesn't, is much less likely to happen. Thank you.
Well,
gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins is now recognized. Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm very sorry. I hope America's paying attention. I'm very sorry that we've hurt our colleagues' feelings by actually showing up in person for Oversight Committee service. America faces an unprecedented labor shortage, massive challenges that cause our economic recovery to struggle because of the majority's decision to spend trillions of dollars in deficit spending, paying people to stay home. Every business owner from sea to shining sea that I've had a conversation with, either in person, on a telephone, in digital town halls, through social media, through direct contact and interaction, meeting with large business organizations that represent the needs and interests of our nations and economic recovery on behalf of employers. The story is the same. We have an incredible challenge facing America today because our workforce is staying home. Why are they staying home? Because the Democrat majority has spent trillions of American dollars that we don't have to pay them to stay home. And the Democrats' answer to that is to hold a virtual committee hearing suggesting that we should pay more people to stay home. It's insulting. It's abhorrent. Our nation is struggling to recover from the CCP virus. Working Americans are fighting to survive. Employers cannot find employees. We face $31 trillion in debt. It's wrong on many levels for Congress to suggest that federal employees need more time off. I had thought to submit for the record the list of benefits for federal employees right now and paid leave right now that federal employees enjoy. Most American employees do not have anything close to that level of benefit and paid leave. But I decided not to because I challenge America. America, I'm talking to you now. Please do some research and look at what your federal counterparts in your industry or your background, your profession, your area of expertise. Compare that to what you've got and what your family faces. I ask America to do its own research. Madam Chair, I appreciate the panelists for being here today. I think this is not the kind of hearing oversight should be conducting, and what we do investigate as an oversight committee should be done in person. That's my opinion, and I yield.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Michigan, Mrs. Tlaib, is recognized. Mrs. Tlaib.
Oh, thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you all so much for this incredibly important hearing. I think for my district, which is the third poorest congressional district in the country, this hearing, for my residents is important as we really do our due diligence to have oversight of what our policies are and what the impact is. And you all know, if anything, COVID has just exposed, this pandemic has just exposed how these systems are set up in a way that doesn't really allow our residents and people to thrive, which does impact our small businesses. And so I just, as a person that is a mother of two, and I still remember, Chairwoman, working at a nonprofit organization, because that's what I want to change the world. I went to law school to do that, and that's what I wanted to do, even though I was in a lot of incredible, high debt, still am. For me, I brought my child to work. He was in the playpen, like behind my desk, and I nursed him there at my desk. I did my conference calls, but I was exhausted. Even thinking about it, I remember breaking down several times, just in tears, because I was tired. I didn't get enough sleep, and it's exhausting. We should not have to, live this way in one of the most wealthiest countries in the world. And so for me, I know many folks on the panelists may or may not know this, and I want to ask you all, the majority of my colleagues in Congress, and no offense to those that are doing well, the majority of them are millionaires. They're completely disconnected to what this hearing is about. They really, truly are. They are living, some are going to stay rooted and connected to the pain and these broken systems that are on the ground. But again, because it's not touching their lives, they are not going to lead with that compassion that I think is needed in Congress. And so, my question, very much, and I don't know if Ms. Manning or Ms. Chabot or, Eric, thank you for testifying today. And again, I think Ms. Bigelow, you can also answer this. For my district, I want to hear from you all. The trauma, really, that we are creating, and talk a little bit about this, to our children. And that, because I know, and I see it, where we are allowing our children to not get the care that they need, or for us to get the emotional and the health care that we need to be able to provide for them and be fully there and present in raising our children. And so can you all talk a little bit about that, and talk about even, again, COVID, if anything, the pandemic just exposed exactly what my residents have been telling me for years, y'all. Like, it's not working, Rashida. It's not sustainable. I can't do it. I can't get the hours. it's just not sustainable. I'm sick going to work and all of those things. So I can start with you, Ms. Chabot, and then maybe go to Eric, and then of course, Ms. Manning and Ms. Bigelow.
Yes, thank you for the question. So, one of the wonderful things we've learned about the impacts of paid leave is about the impact on infant and maternal health. Lower rates of maternal depression, higher rates of breastfeeding, higher rates of children getting immunized on time, lower rates of head trauma, and better educational outcomes. And, to your point about Congress being disconnected, 85% of Americans, 84% of Americans overwhelmingly want Congress to enact a national paid family and medical leave program. These are taxpayers. They're willing to pay for this program. They're willing to have corporations pay for this program. They're willing to have the wealthy pay for this program. Whatever the financing source, including themselves, they want this done. So thank you so much for your question.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I appreciate the opportunity to chime in as well. Looking back at COVID, it was really clear to us as a business that the first line of defense for employee safety, for all our safety, was to make sure folks who were sick or potentially exposed wouldn't come into work. But the plain truth of it is, just asking employees to stay home without offering them pay is just preposterous. You can't expect our lower wage employees to make that choice. So, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act is really, really essential for us. And a program like that, I think it's just plain as day that we need that if we want to have safe communities and safe workplaces.
I can just chime in briefly that my last pregnancy during the pandemic, and having an infant child during a pandemic, it was very hard. And part of the reason it was so challenging is because of the social isolation and the lack of community supports that are usually there. And I'm hopeful that we can get back to a place as a country where I will have, more freedom and more comfort in interacting with grandparents and the rest of the church community and so forth. I think that stuff is so important. And I think that paid leave policy is also very important. And that's why I just want to be sure that the solutions that we're considering and pursuing are the ones that come with the least downside. That, just like it's true that public and private sector workers are married to each other, we're in this together, we're part of the American community. So are taxpayers and families. Families are taxpayers. It's not as if those are two separate groups of people. And so we have to be considerate of our needs as working moms and working dads and families, but also the bottom line when it comes to, our incomes and how much resources we have, how much taxes
There's always going to be challenges. And Ms. Bigelow, if I may, Chairwoman, if she can do the final answer, please.
Actually, your time has expired, so Ms. Bigelow will have to submit it to the record for us.
Oh,
The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Keller, is recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Keller.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The logic of not having this hearing take place in person, the fact that we're having it 100% virtually is baffling. The COVID-19 requirements have been lifted across the nation, including in Washington, D.C. All anyone has to do that's watching this proceeding is turn on C-SPAN later on when we're all on the House floor, including the Speaker, Democratic leadership, Republican leadership, all of us, gather together exactly like we should be doing in this committee. Not conducting 100% in-person committee meetings is a barrier to effectively serving the people we work for, the people we represent. The people that I represent, the people that all of us represent across America, go to work every day and get the job done. Our job here in Congress to represent them should be no different as we tackle the challenges that face our nation. So getting into why we're here, Ms. Manning, what are some of the examples of the reasons why federal employees use FMLA?
I imagine that federal employees use FMLA for the same reason that private sector's workers might use FMLA for the birth or adoption of a child, for medical emergency, for caregiving, and so forth.
Yeah, a personal illness or an illness of somebody in the family or a birth of a child, whether those illnesses would be emotional or whether they would be physical.
I believe they have to get approval from a healthcare professional to merit their FMLA absence.
During 2020, Congress directed dollars toward programs to assist federal employees who had to stay home due to COVID-19. Ms. Manning, do we have all the performance data to determine how beneficial this policy was?
I don't know if someone else has that data. I do not have it.
Okay. The proposal we're discussing today would allow the federal employees to take 12 weeks of paid leave for any reason under FMLA. Is there any estimate, Ms. Manning, that you would have seen that would cost the taxpayers?
No.
Okay. And taking a look at what we're doing, all Americans, including those in federal government, those who work for state and municipal authorities, and those working for private sector businesses of all sizes, deserve to be able to take the time they need to either attend to their own health or assist a loved one. These benefits should be flexible and workable for both employers and employees. We need to be helping employers grow their business so they can provide the benefits to their employees. The majority's proposal under discussion today gives federal employees up to 4 months off when you include all the time that they would have for holidays and so on and additional time. That's 1/3 of the year. And the thing I want to take a look at as a former small business operator, these standards are flat out, they're not workable. Having hardworking taxpayers foot the bill for this, is just not responsible, good policy. And I want to give you an example of when I was, when my son was in the hospital on life support. The employer I worked for, I had a check every week for that time we were at his bedside for that month, because they could afford to do it. Because that's what our employers do. As I mentioned in a hearing with Secretary Walsh, I asked him if he believed that the businesses in America, the small businesses that are owned by our families, friends, neighbors, our constituents, cared about the health and welfare of their employees. And after the second time, I got him to admit he did. And I believe that of the people that I represent, that own businesses and go to work every day in PA 12. And I don't think they need the government telling them what the right thing to do is. If the business can afford to do it, and somebody in their team needs help, they will do it. If there's a member of the team in my office that had an issue, I would certainly afford them the time to deal with that issue. And having a law telling us what is behavior, what we should be doing as human beings, is just big government. Not having the trust in the American people.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Not having the trust in the American people to do the right things.
Okay.
And that's where I am different. And a lot of my colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle are different. We have that faith in the American people. We have that faith in individuals, that we don't need our government to try and legislate morality. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman from the great state of New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, is now recognized.
Chairwoman Maloney, and you know, we just heard some examples about what may or may not happen with paid leave. I'd like to provide, just very quickly before I start my example, when we first started and opened our office, I decided to offer, and not even offer, you know, we decided that as a matter of policy that we were going to provide 3 months of parental leave, both for all parents, birthing, non-birthing, adoptive, etc. And that includes fathers as well. And what we have found has been that it's been a profoundly successful policy. But I think also, to just counter on the point that was immediately made, is that having time with our families should not be a matter of charity or profitability. And the fact of the matter is that deciding on having paid leave and the decision and the ability to have paid leave is not about how good or charitable your employer is. It's not about whether they're a good person. And it certainly shouldn't be about whether it's profitable for a business. It should be about the importance of value of family and human beings. And these are rights for us. And parents, mothers, fathers, the human development of children should not be decided by how profitable that leave is for a business. It should be a right that is afforded to all parents and all people and all human beings. And moving on, you know, I think I want to narrow in on dads. Let's talk about fathers and the right of fathers to have parental leave, and all non-birthing parents as well. You know, being a parent, a mom, a dad, etc., looks different for every family. And we don't have to subscribe to this binary of a parent that had physically birthed a child needs or deserves more leave or time than a non-birthing parent. The fact is that we need to have leave for all parents, because both, even if you have a birthing parent, you cannot do that alone. I mean, I want to dig into that a little bit. Ms. Bigelow, you and your colleagues at the National Partnership for Women and Families recently published your findings on the need of fathers for having paid family and medical leave. You stated some of these facts earlier, and I apologize for the redundancy, but I think it's really critical for some of my colleagues to hear this again. So, Ms. Bigelow, you said that just 5% of fathers in professional jobs took more than 2 weeks off after their most recent child was born, correct?
Yes.
And we know that low-income dads have it even worse because of the lack of paid leave. So one study of disadvantaged families showed that nearly 60% of dads reported taking 0 weeks of paid time away from work after the birth or adoption of a child. Does that sound about right to you?
Yes.
And we know that the first year after a child's birth or adoption is critical to their development or adjustment inside a new home. So fathers are more likely to remain involved in parenting and to equitably divide household chores with their partners if they take time off after their child is born, right?
That's right.
And it's true that new moms and new birthing parents have fewer postpartum health complications and improved mental health when new dads also take parental leave, right? Or take paid leave.
Yes.
So we see that dads having and non-birthing parents taking equitable paid leave is good for the parent, it's good for the birthing parent and the mom, and it's good for baby. In my home state in New York, women make up about half of New York's labor force. You know, and I think one of the things that we've seen in my personal experience, we have fully paid parental leave, and we've had a couple of new dads in my office take it. And one of the things that I've noticed so much is that after, you know, eventually we all go back to work, and sometimes they come and bring the baby, and we'll be with our whole families together in gatherings. And we see that too. Moms say, "Thank you so much for letting my husband stay with me, because I could not recover physically and handle a new baby and try to keep a home together all by myself." And so I'm wondering, Ms. Bigelow, how do you think this contributes to income inequity between you know, new mothers and fathers? And anyone else on the panel, feel free to chime in as well. And
time has expired, but the gentlewoman Bigelow may answer the question.
So I'll just answer really quickly and say that no new mom should feel alone to recover from birth and get used to parenting. And I credit our own stability in my family to the fact that my husband was able to take 12 weeks paid paternity leave to the generous benefit provided by Congresswoman Nita Lowey. And so we were able to really have a good start for our family because of that. And I can't imagine not having that if I were a low wage worker.
Madam Chairman, can I just chime in there?
Yes, Mr. Kelly, you are recognized briefly.
Thank you so much. You know, paid parental leave has been a godsend for those who have to use it so far, right? I'm a father, and I can recall those precious weeks after there was a new addition to the family. The new baby needs attention. The whole family needs the care and love and attention that, you know, only can be provided given that they have no stress about being able to pay rent and other expenses. The vast majority of federal employees, especially those young enough to be starting families, do not earn enough to skip even one paycheck. Take, for instance, I hear a lot of talk about how much federal employees average a year. But when you take TSA workers that average about $35,000 a year, you know, with a new family, and then you got to worry about the house note, car note, and all of these bills and the stresses of those things, they will not be able to take off and work and take care of the family, bond with that family as necessary. So I just wanted to say that. And this FMLA leave is a necessary addition to the family parental leave. So I appreciate everyone's that's promoting this and that's sponsoring this. It's a necessary thing for underpaid federal employees.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time has expired. She has yielded back. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Fallon, you are now recognized for your statement and question.
Madam Chair, thank you. And you can certainly say the great state of Texas anytime you like. So, you know, interesting to hear some earlier rants and lectures about this. But again, I always like to look at kind of some statistics and share with our colleagues and friends. The federal, and I hope I'm getting all this right, but we have to trust some of the folks that we called for this research, that federal employees, all the federal employees are entitled to a pension once they are vested. Private sector, according to the National Compensation Survey done by the Bureau of Labor, 12% of private sector employees get a pension. The paid sick leave in the private sector averages 7 days a year, and the federal employees average 13. Vacation is a little harder to quantify as far as average, but it looks like about 14 days with private sector and 20 days with the federal employees. Paid holidays, private sector it's 8, and federal employees it's now 11. So some other things to consider, and sick leave, from what we were told, that 13 days can be carried over to the next year and continue indefinitely. So after, say, 10 years, it's conceivable that a federal employee could have banked 130 sick days. And vacation, they can only carry over 240 hours, which is about 30 days. And they're getting, once they're established, and I'm talking about an employee that's been around for, say, 7 years or plus, gets 20 days leave. So, but that would be a usual lose if they're banking and bringing over the 30. So in a given year, you could have an employee, a federal employee, have about 180 days. Now, I don't know, and I suspect that they could use sick leave for maternity leave. And if they cannot, I would certainly support letting them use that 12 weeks to cash in, because this is about saving. I mean, we can't live day to day, and we need to save money as best we can for that rainy day. That's what I was taught growing up. When my parents are retired school teachers. My father retired after 25, 30 year service with all of making $38,000 a year, but we saved for those rainy days. And then you have to look at the cost of this, and it's hard to quantify because there's no CBO estimate, and nobody sought to ask the OPM. So there's been no due diligence on this, and it's a dereliction of duty to vote on this or form an opinion when we don't even know the cost. That's what we're the caretakers of the taxpayer dollars, and federal employees work for the taxpayers. I really, unfortunately, feel that this is a cover for a socialistic policy. And if 12 weeks is great, yeah, I mean, I owned a business, and I had an employee that had cancer, and she was a loyal employee, and I told her job, but I was in that position, her job was to get better. And for 2 years I paid her, but that was the decision that we made. And it wasn't forced or compelled upon us by anyone. And that's the difference between the private sector and the public sector, and particularly federal employees. And then I've heard for hours now, the fact that, apparently Americans are helpless, and there's no such thing as personal responsibility. And there's certain decisions that you need to make. I started out in the Air Force making $18,500 a year, and I had certain decisions. I didn't want to get married, and I didn't want to have children making $18,500 a year. I was responsible enough to know that wasn't going to be a good outcome. And we have to trust the American people. Government is not God, and government's and it's not a parent. It's a bad parent. And with that, Madam Chair, from the great state of Texas, Pat Fallon yields back. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. The gentlewoman from Missouri, the great state of Missouri, Ms. Bush, is recognized for 5 minutes.
St. Louis, and I thank you, Madam Chair, for convening this hearing. Just sitting here listening to what some of my colleagues are saying is absolutely just blows my mind how we can speak from a place of I have it and everything else should be great the same way that it's great for me, but it's not. It's not that way for everybody, and maybe we need to bring it back to that everybody doesn't have the same. We don't have equity in this country. We don't have equality in this country, and so maybe opening your eyes to seeing that there is somebody else that's suffering a different way than you. And so, I feel like, the thing is this: we have to look at more than just our little square box. But thank you for your leadership on this, Chairwoman, and the leadership of those on this committee. The federal government now guarantees paid parental leave to its employees. We know paid parental leave is a strong start, but it's not at all enough leave for federal workers or for workers more broadly. And I know this from personal experience. Twice in my life, I have been fired or threatened with firing from a job for running out of paid leave or something related to the paid leave while I was too sick to work. Both incidents could have happened to anyone. In one case, I was the victim of sexual violence. It was violence upon my body that I did not ask for. And because mental health isn't paid for, because when you have this mental health situation going on, how do you keep your home? How do you keep, I almost lost my home. I almost lost my car. I almost lost everything because I couldn't deal with that sexual assault and it wasn't my fault. The other one, I was T-boned in my car and I couldn't walk for weeks. And I remember, as a matter of fact, when I started to get a little bit better, Rep. Ocasio-Cortez came to be with me and she literally carried me down the street. It's photos of that. It's not that I didn't want to go to work. I physically could not be a nurse. It's not that people want free handouts. It's that, how do we take care of ourselves? And this is the other thing. We also have to remember, when you lose a staff person that has been with you, it costs a lot of money. It costs a lot of money to be able to get someone else in and train them and get them back to the point of the skill and the talent, the knowledge with that company that the other person had. So why not invest in the worker that you had? Why not give them the space that they need to heal? It's ridiculous, the things that I'm hearing today. Imagine punishing a low-wage worker in response to a traumatic life event. You punish them for that trauma. Imagine a nurse being fired for being sick. Imagine trying to return to work, but being unable to and being fired for it. Like me, millions of people don't have that, that don't have to imagine it. It's a reality that happens every single day, and we see why. Unfortunately, federal workers are not guaranteed paid leave for any reason specified in the Family and Medical Leave Act of 1993 other than childcare. This leaves workers without affordable options when they have to take time off from work to address a health issue or take care of a family member. Mr. Kelly, great to see you again, and thank you for all your work. How would your members benefit if they had access to paid leave during other situations when they need to care for themselves or their families?
Can I just give you a story?
Yes.
Okay, let me tell you a story about a young man, right? He had worked, and he's a TSA worker, worked, has a wife, and his wife is diabetic. A few months ago, had to have a kidney transplant. He had to use a lot of leave to take care of her, about 2.5 months, right? Because she was very ill after the transplant. He had a son that had been working, sending to college, right? Then a few weeks later, the doctors discovered that the body was rejecting the kidney, okay? So they had to go in and remove it. She became very ill. So that means they had to stay away from work again, okay? So that became very stressful for the family, couldn't pay the bills. And the son that had worked so hard to say, go to college, I want you to go to college, I want you to be a productive citizen, the father had to ask him to come out of college and get a job in order to help them pay the bills so that they would lose their homes and all these things. So I just agree with you. Everybody don't have it like that. There are people, and pastoring for 31 years, to sit here and hear the inhumanity of what I'm hearing here today, that's supposed to be representing our country, supposed to be representing all of humanity, and there is no humanity in it. It bothers me. It tells me that people are not concerned about the well-being of the American family. We're concerned with those that already got it. Everybody don't have it.
The gentleman's time has expired and the chair recognizes herself shortly. I just want to commend Mrs. Bush for pointing out that public policy is not made on the goodness of one person's heart. One person can be very thoughtful and wonderful to their employees, but there can be another situation where she pointed out where people are hurt unjustly in many ways and lose their jobs, lose their form of employment and way to provide for their families. Public policy has to be made on what is best for the American people. And that is what we're discussing today. We are not voting on this bill today. We are having a debate and discussion on it. I yield back and I now recognize the gentleman from the great state of Georgia. Mr. Clyde, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member, for holding today's hearing. And yes, Georgia is a great state. Thank you. Our country is facing several crises: the Biden border crisis, the Biden crime crisis, the Biden economic crisis, the Biden energy crisis as we see gas prices go up and up and up, and the employment crisis. I'm constantly hearing, as I travel across my district, it's clear to me that families are hurting from inflation and are worried about illicit drugs flooding their communities because of the crisis at the southern border. I'm constantly hearing from small business owners about how labor shortages are plaguing their ability to hire talented workers. Thankfully, Georgia's governor, Brian Kemp, through his direct order, has ended the extra payments from the federal government so that we can get hardworking Georgians back to work. I'm a small businessman by trade, and I can tell you that small and even large businesses operate a whole lot differently than does the federal government. I mean the fact that the government, or should I say Congress, decides how much we'll spend before even putting a budget together. Is that backwards in and of itself? Not to mention the fact that we're not required to balance our budget every year. No wonder our government is in such poor fiscal condition. As a business owner, I had to work to bring in revenue, which was dependent on consumer demand, on customer service, on community engagement, on marketing, among other things. You also must balance your budget as a small business owner and plan to make adjustments if times are good or if they're tough. If times are good, and hopefully they stay good, benefits typically become more generous than the basic benefits employers provide to retain quality employees. But when times are tough, sometimes you have to adjust to keep people on the payroll because you don't want to let anybody go. You want to keep all your good employees. To the contrary, if the government wants to increase its revenue stream, all it has to do is raise taxes. Easy as that. Flip a switch and more money flows in. But who pays the price for flipping that switch? The American people. And if we don't have the money now, we borrow it. And so who pays the price? Our children. So for Ms. Manning, I have a question for you. I just outlined some ways in which the government operates differently from private employers, and I briefly touched on differences in benefits in good times and bad times. Do the benefits for federal employees get adjusted down when times are tough?
To my knowledge, they do not.
They do not. You're absolutely right. So it sounds like the federal government's benefits are completely stable. And yet, with all these advantages, we're sitting here today considering the chairwoman's proposal to further expand the already generous benefits for federal employees. What do you think that says to the average American, seeing that their federal employee counterparts are getting more benefits than private citizens who are struggling to recover from the pandemic? What do you think that says to the American people, ma'am?
You know, I think we've struggled as a country to maintain wide respect for any type of large institution, whether it's the media or the government or academic institutions. I would love to see greater public trust in those institutions, but I don't think it fosters good public trust when we feel that there's an elite political class who can vote new benefits for themselves or for the federal workforce, and that often I think fosters a sense of detachment from the citizens that you serve.
I agree with you. Do you think the federal government needs to make its benefits even more generous than they already are right now to compete for labor?
No, as an economic question, I think it's pretty clear there's no economic necessity of that.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate that very much. You know, it's one thing to provide a benefit like this during an extraordinary period like COVID-19, but it's another entirely to make this a permanent benefit for all times, good and bad. Thank you for your response. I appreciate that. You know, I'm a 28-year military officer, and 11 years of that was spent on active duty. And the military gives 30 days of paid leave every year, but that 30 days includes weekends. So if I take straight 30 days, then I have 4 weekends. I have 8 days of weekend days that are included in that paid leave. While I know signing up for active duty is much different than signing up for the civilian workforce, you know, both are public servants, and at the end of the day, their salaries are paid by the taxpayers. So it's, in my opinion, it's egregious that we're sitting here today considering a proposal that would only require federal civil servants to work 9 months of the year. It's an affront to our servicemen and women who sacrifice everything, as well as to taxpayers who will be on the hook to pay for the additional benefits. And with that, from the great state of Georgia, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and the gentleman from Illinois, the great state of Illinois, Mr. Davis, is now recognized.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. You know, as I was listening to the Biden crisis, I was just reminded that President Biden has done more for low and moderate income children and families than we've seen in this country.
Well, he's admitting that it's the Biden
Society program. And so that's one way of dealing with and addressing crisis. But we're really talking about something else at the moment. I am in favor of paid family medical leave. As a matter of fact, not only am I in favor of it, I introduced it. And so I am definitely in favor of it. I was just wondering though, because I've always been taught that a satisfied workforce is far more productive than a workforce that is not satisfied. So when we start talking about cost, if we keep the workforce satisfied, they're going to be more productive according to all of the research and all of the studies that I've ever heard anything about. Of course, Illinois is a great state, but I represent a large number of people in Chicago who are disproportionately among those lacking paid leave benefits, often because they are single parents or grandparents, caregivers who need caregiving flexibility. They are often lower paid individuals in the workforce and don't get all of the benefits that others might get. Ms. Shabo, let me ask you, my congressional district has one of the highest percentages of children being cared for by their grandparents. The burden of caregiving often falls heavily on African-American women, with many of these grandmothers working, caring for young children and aging family members, and also dealing with their own medical issues. Could you discuss why a broad definition of family is needed to make sure that everyone who needs it can get the family caregiving leave and get their needs met?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the question. You know, like constituents in your district, families across the country come in all shapes and sizes. They're caring for different members of their family. They treat members of their family require care, and different people may be available. But too often policies leave extended family members behind: grandparents, grandchildren, siblings, adult children, and others who folks care for like family. 14% of workers who needed but didn't take an FMLA leave in 2018 said that they couldn't because they were caring for somebody who wasn't covered by the FMLA. One of the great innovations in state paid family and medical leave programs is that every single one of them now covers a broader definition of family. And this is incredibly important, particularly for families of color, for families with people who have disabilities, for LGBTQ families, and for women in particular who bear the brunt of caregiving, whether it is paid or unpaid, or whether they have to leave their jobs in order to provide care for those who they love.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kelly, I've heard lots about the number of days that federal employees have to work. Do you know any rules that require individuals to take all of the family medical leave that they may have available to them?
There is no rule, sir. And what I would like, if I might add just a little bit, I think we should refocus on what this discussion is all about, right? Because every federal employee will not be able to take 4 months of leave. That's not what this is all about. And to propose that would be a lie. It would be a lie to the American people. Because if you think about, how many federal employees will have a person in their family that will fall into the category that they'll be able to take, these 12 weeks. It's just not the truth. It's not true, even to the fact that I heard earlier that federal employees haven't given up anything, but it's not true. If you remember back in 2013 and 2014, it was federal employees that gave up retirement benefits. They was cut. It was the federal employees, and all of this pay was for extended unemployment insurance. And remember that we're not political appointees. We are federal employees. And to bring these untruths forth today really bothers me.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from the great state of Vermont, Mr. Welsh, you are now recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Welsh.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm going to be asking a few questions of Eric Sorkin very shortly, but I just want to introduce it by saying a little bit about his business. He and his wife, Laura, created a business called Run Amok Maple. It produces the tastiest product in the world, and that's Vermont maple syrup. And they've grown it into a business with 75 employees. And we're very, very proud of our small businesses and Run Amok Maple. And I know that my colleagues have similar stories about successful small businesses in their districts. And the question here about family leave is one where the debate is about whether government should play a role. And Mr. Keller said we should leave this up to individual businesses. And the reality is that most businesses, I think, are like the Sorkins. If they can, they want to do whatever is possible for their employees. It's like a family. And that, I think, is universal across the country. But there's a question of whether all businesses can do it. So, Mr. Sorkin, I want to welcome you and ask you if you could say why it's important for small businesses that the federal government does offer a national paid family and medical leave benefit. Does a national policy help level the playing field with business competitors who may not be able to or don't want to provide the same benefit to their employees?
Thank you, Representative Welch. Absolutely, I completely agree. I guess from my perspective, it shouldn't be about whether a worker is working for a company that can afford to do it or not. We do it, and that's a burden on us, irrespective of the fact that we feel like there's a good return on that investment. I don't see the downside to having a national program that would help workers, would help us as well. When we're recruiting, and we've talked a lot about how hard it is to recruit right now, we're at a significant disadvantage to bigger companies that can afford to do it. So it would absolutely be leveling the playing field. From
right. And as I understand it, you and your wife responded to a human situation. You had a valued employee. His wife had terminal cancer. He couldn't lose the paycheck. He couldn't be home. And he was caught between a rock and a hard place. And you guys decided, hey, this is our employee. We trust him, value him, and we want to let him do what we'd like to do on our own if the circumstances were reversed. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right.
And without any support, you had to eat the cost of that.
That's right.
Right. And so you mentioned the effect on morale in your company that you did institute this. And by the way, to my colleagues, 75 employees is a small business. It's a big deal in Vermont. And by the way, maple syrup, it's a lot of hard work. You're out in the woods getting that maple syrup that we just get on our breakfast table. But tell us a little bit about how it affected morale in your company.
Well, I mean, it's been, a few weeks ago, there was a statistic that I think Vermont had the tightest labor market in the country. I believe it was 5.1 job postings for every person on unemployment. We recently posted a position for production associates. We have several that we're hiring for. And we received about 150 applications in a few weeks. We're pretty well known for our policies, and I'm fairly certain that's part of why we continue.
That's great. And let me ask you this. What impact did the Family First coronavirus response have on your company? Would your business have survived the pandemic without a federally funded paid leave policy?
It made our decisions easier, and it kept our business and our employees healthy. It was essential, no doubt about it.
Well, I want to thank you because I think you've been a successful small business. We know how hard it is to make an enterprise like yours successful. And your point about a level playing field so that all employers have this option where they're not putting themselves at a competitive disadvantage if they choose to help their employees, I think is very compelling. Thank you. Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from the great state of Georgia, Mr. Heiss, is now recognized. Mr.
Thank
Heiss.
you, Madam Chair. Ms. Manning, let me come to you. Democrats have not provided any information on this bill regarding the cost. Would you anticipate that this piece of legislation would be a good idea for the American taxpayer?
I'm sure it comes with some cost. Unfortunately, we don't know what that cost is, but simply the term paid leave implies that someone's paying for it. So someone has to be paid, someone has to pay.
Do you have any idea what type of, just an estimate, something like this might cost?
No, especially given that federal workers already have paid parental leave. So we're just talking about the additional marginal cost of other medical paid leaves that would fall outside of the parental leave category. I don't know, but it would come with some cost.
Yeah, and I would think the cost would be rather significant. And it just seems to me the logical progression of dealing with legislation in a responsible manner, that if you're going to pass legislation that is going to have a significant price tag associated with it, it'd be a good idea to know what that price tag is, especially in behalf of the taxpayers.
Certainly, and I think that's true regardless how lawmakers feel, if or members of the public, if we feel that paid leave is a right or something that everyone should be entitled to, the question still remains, how do we manage limited resources? How do we pay for the things that we want people to have? And that's true of both paid leave for federal workers and a broader federal program that might provide paid leave or pay replacement for all workers.
Well, beyond the cost factor is also this whole question of assessing how do you work your workforce through that? What's the impact that something like this would have on the workforce? I mean, we're dealing with something like this. I shared in my opening statement, we're talking 12 weeks plus other holidays and benefits. A federal worker really, we're talking working 8 months out of a year, potentially. So we have 4 months of a gap. How does the private sector, how could anyone deal with employees who are gone a third of the time?
Well, I think there's a variety of downsides that would come with a national paid leave program. And it's not just the cost in terms of new taxes. Of course, I believe that deserves examination as well. But when we talk about a paid leave entitlement that would apply broadly to the nation, first of all, we've recognized that many employers in the private sector have already acted to put in place some kind of paid leave benefit for their employees. And in some cases, paternal leave and medical leave. When you establish a national standard through a federal program, you immediately reorient all of those individualized private solutions that employees have worked out between themselves. And you start to create an incentive for employers to simply comply with the federal standard and pay for the national entitlement rather than go directly to their workforce, to their workers and say, what can we work out? What kind of flexible arrangement works for you? How many weeks do you want? Do you want to come back part-time or full-time or virtual and so forth? And there are myriad different solutions that work for different industries, different workers, different seasons of life that workers might be in. And so we ought to be at a time where the American economy and businesses and families are more diverse than they've ever been, encouraging those diverse solutions rather than coming forward with a one-size-all-fits solution.
Well, I agree with you. And at a bare minimum, I think any private company dealing with this type of policy would at least have, I would think, an assessment of sorts to determine the impact that something like this would have on their workforce. Do you know of any such assessment that has taken place on the federal government to determine the impact that this would have on the workforce?
I do not.
Okay. And just last question, I know you've touched on this, but coming out of COVID, which we all thank God we're coming out of, seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, but there's no question so many businesses have been kicked in the gut, individual families, livelihoods across the board. Many of them have lost everything they've had. Some of them just inched their way through and now trying to recover. Even a bill like this, were it to become law and be enacted, do you think that's a good idea timing wise for so many private individuals who have just suffered tremendously?
Well, I certainly think it's the case that one of the biggest economic problems, particularly for Americans who are in poverty, on the brink of poverty, is the lack of an income, full stop. They need a job, they need income. And the requirement that, or the suggestion that those jobs have to come with a full plate of benefits, whether it's health insurance or an increased minimum wage or these paid leave proposals that we're talking about today, that simply increases the cost of creating those jobs that Americans desperately need and want in order to provide for themselves and their families.
Thank you very much, Ms. Manning. And with that, I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes for questioning. Ms. Bigelow, you've said that you worked from the day that you gave birth to your child. Could you explain briefly why you felt like you had to be working up to the very last moment before you gave birth?
Sure. And after too, that day, because every moment was really critical to getting the most time that was paid for me after my FMLA started and it was unpaid. So I knew that like if he was going to be in the NICU for 10 days, if I could still do some work there, and that would buy me 10 extra days to actually bond with my baby.
And that really resonates with me. I had 3 children while teaching as a professor, and I was scheduled to teach a class on the day of my planned cesarean section with my 3rd child. And the dean ultimately prevailed on me to reschedule and cancel that class, but I really felt the need to use all of the time that I could. And I know you said that you returned to work sooner. What motivated that? Was it the stress about your family's financial stability? Was it concern about your career? How did that affect your decisions about giving birth and having a child and how it intersected with work?
So I did take 12 weeks off, but instead of only missing 1 or 2 paychecks, I ended up missing more because I took time off when I was in the hospital, and I took time off for all of those appointments. And there was a government shutdown in between. So it was a very stressful time, just trying to juggle all the finances of having a new baby, having a new house, and all of those things. And so it was, a very difficult decision to try to be determined and try and to be there for my family, because I knew that was going to be more important than a job.
You've also written about your mother's fear of taking time off from her retail job to care for you. Can you talk about what that meant for your family?
Yes. And I think people are very, they grow up and you have a reaction to how your environment is. And it made me, really dedicated to this work, and to know that I needed to fight for the kinds of policies in workplaces that didn't cause fear for workers. And I think for my mom, and when she was trying to take care of me, she always was worried that I would be sick. She was worried that she could be sick, and that created a lot of stress in our household. And I know that impacts everyone's health. And those are things that I really didn't want to pass on for my family.
Well, and I think it's clear that the need for paid leave is not new, although the pandemic may have exacerbated or reignited interest in this issue. The reality is that we have multiple generations now of working women and families that have been harmed by a lack of paid leave. And it's disproportionately hurt people who work particularly in industries like retail and food services, for whom even a few days of unpaid time off could jeopardize their job or their ability to put food on the table. Ms. Chabot, turning to you, how much do American families lose each year in income as a result of insufficient paid leave policy?
Thanks for the question, Representative Porter. The Center for American Progress estimates $22.5 billion lost to families every year because of a lack of paid leave or insufficient paid leave.
$22.5 billion is an awful lot of groceries, an awful lot of diapers, an awful lot of utility bills that people are going without. And about how many workers are we talking about here who contribute to that 22.5 billion? How many workers are being harmed by this?
Yeah, I mean, around 20 million workers a year take paid leave, take FMLA leave, and only a small share of those are paid adequately or paid at all.
And we have talked about a lot of, and some of my colleagues in this committee hearing today have talked about this as a progressive priority. This is a women's issue. This is a kids issue. Ms. Chabot, who is hurt by the lack of paid leave in this country?
Everybody is hurt by the lack of leave in this country, whether it's you directly or the economy or a business. This is not a nice to have. It's not a frill. It is a necessity for getting our economy back on track and creating households that are stable and secure going forward.
Are men hurt by a lack of paid leave?
Absolutely. We did a report at New America on men in caregiving, including a big national survey, finding that men want to be able to provide care. They want to be able to be there for their families. But not only is it a matter of not having access to pay or fearing for your job, it's also stigma around the gendered nature of care. And when men want to break out of that mold, they have a hard time.
How about Democrats? Do Democratic workers want to take paid leave?
All workers want to take paid leave. All workers want to know that paid leave is there for them when they need it. And that's why we see in polls before the pandemic, during the pandemic now, 85% of workers want national paid leave. That's 75% of Republicans, 80-something% of independents, and 95% of Democrats. The only place this is a partisan issue is in the halls of Congress and in some legislatures, but not all legislatures. So we've seen laws passed with bipartisan support in Oregon and Washington and Massachusetts, and there's no need for the partisan division here. This is common sense.
Absolutely. And so Republican workers, Democratic workers, independent voters, workers who vote, workers who don't vote, people are having families, and it affects not just the worker, but it affects the workforce broadly. And so one of the things I say over and over again, and I just want to say it here to echo what you just said, that paid leave is not something that we do just for women, just for kids, just for progressives, just for whatever. Paid leave is something we do for everyone. Whether you have never had a child or never want one, whether you're 50 years past your child-rearing years or you're just entering them, paid leave makes our economy stronger. And I don't think there's any American who shouldn't want our country to have a strong, globally competitive economy, and we can't do that without paid leave. Thank you very much. I'm now going to recognize Mr. Johnson, the gentleman from Tennessee, for 5 minutes.
Okay, I want to thank the chairwoman for holding this hearing, and this issue of paid family and medical leave is one that is so important, and I thank the witnesses today for their testimony and advocacy efforts, because Americans faced unprecedented challenges during the COVID-19 pandemic. 600,000 dead, 34 million infected, and many people are still living with life-altering health consequences. And the experiences of our constituents have shown us that the federal government must implement a comprehensive paid family and medical leave policy, and we must do so now. It's a shameful tribute that it has taken us this long. The moment is here, and we must not let this moment pass. Even my home state of Georgia, which is ground zero for voter suppression, recently established 3 weeks of paid parental leave for state employees. While we still have plenty of work left to do, this advancement was the latest result of tireless work by advocates from across the state and the nation. And I want to applaud you for your efforts, and I know that those efforts will continue. I keep hearing from my friends on the other side of the aisle today about the costs of paid family and medical leave to the taxpayers, and that we can't afford to do family medical leave. I would remind my friends that it is the working people who pay the taxes, not the wealthy and the corporations. They don't pay taxes because of all the loopholes in the tax code that they use to shelter their income. And we will never forget the Trump Republican Party tax cut of 2017, which cut $5.8 trillion in taxes for 83%, or excuse me, for the top 1%, 83% of that $5.8 trillion in tax cuts went to the top 1%, while at the same time raising taxes on working people to try to fill the hole in the federal deficit. Yet it is those same wealthy people and corporate interests, most notably the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the Koch brothers, and others, who have the biggest influence on policy because of their ability to spend dark money, putting pro-business politicians in office who do their bidding rather than serve the people. Big business and the politicians who support them are the ones who oppose family and medical leave protections for workers. And working people who pay the taxes should be able to allocate their taxes to support themselves during their times of need, rather than subsidizing the wealthy who don't pay taxes. Ms. Bigelow, in 2018, the National Partnership for Women and Families conducted a nationwide survey on paid leave. What did the survey reveal about American workers' support or lack thereof for the concept of paid family and medical leave?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. We've actually done a number of different surveys beyond 2018 and even as recently as last year. And we always find that paid leave has bipartisan support, and it has a majority of support from Republicans, Democrats, and independents.
Yeah, in fact, 94% of Democrats and 73% of Republicans supported paid leave. Isn't that correct?
Yes, that sounds right.
Now, these numbers are staggering, and I can't think of another policy proposal with such bipartisan support. But yet, states across the nation have not been responsive to public support for expanded and comprehensive paid leave policies. What factors are contributing to the failure of states to pass laws requiring that workers receive paid leave?
Well, you know, I will say there's been a lot of momentum in the states over the past few years to pass paid leave laws, but I really think it's time for a national policy, for a national standard. And so while our campaigns still are being started in different states, I think what we're seeing in like a lot of these areas, it's a bipartisan issue, but we're also working to get a national.
Well, you're right about that. What is stopping us from getting a national paid leave policy passed?
I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what this means, and particularly it sounds like the cost issue. The fact of the matter,
and so those who are not paying the cost want to dictate to those who are paying the cost how to allocate that money. It's really quite. The
gentleman's time has expired.
It's really quite ridiculous, and with that, I will yield back.
Thank you so much, sir. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky for 5 minutes. Mr. Comer, you're on mute, sir. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't know where to begin. I've been sitting patiently listening to the comments from my Democrat colleagues. I sat through the technical difficulties of having a virtual hearing when we could all be right down the hall in the committee room. You know, one thing that Representative Davis said, he said, you know, we need to keep the federal workforce satisfied. I mean, that's a disconnect with reality, with the reality of the taxpayers. The federal workforce needs to keep the taxpayers satisfied with the production and with the way their tax dollars are being spent. We just had a briefing with the VA. Right now, if a veteran calls any of our offices and asks for their VA records, it may take a year for them to get their records from the VA. The VA, I asked the question, are your workers back to work yet? Oh, no, it's still, you know, it's still dangerous to be out there. Well, those poor veterans, you know, people in the private sector have had to go back to work. We just passed the Juneteenth bill last week with overwhelming bipartisan support. That gave the federal workers another day off. And the next committee hearing we have an oversight, talk about more federal benefits and perks for federal employees. The biggest problem in America right now is workers can't find employees. They can't find employees. Factories aren't at full production. Our economy isn't anywhere near its potential because of the policies of the Biden administration. The policies to pay people to continue to work, to continue to not work, to sit at home. And with all the problems in America right now, with all the hearings that we have pleaded to have with the majority, we have a border crisis. We have a crime crisis in the big cities. We have inflation. We have credible evidence that shows, despite your all calling it conspiracy theories, that COVID started in Wuhan. You don't want to have any hearings on that. Nothing on that. You know, we're not blaming you all for COVID. We're blaming China for COVID. We want to have hearings, bipartisan hearings on that. Do you want to give federal workers more benefits? You want to continue to pay people not to work? It's just a total disconnect. It's a total disconnect. And it highlights the differences between what Republicans in the House are pushing for and fighting for and what Democrats in the House are fighting for. Ms. Manning, what should the process be to consider paid leave vacation, to fully understand the costs, trade-offs, and consequences?
Well, every employer will have to do their own cost benefit analysis. The federal government has to do a cost benefit analysis, and it sounds like there hasn't been sufficient exploration of the costs without a cost estimate from CBO or elsewhere. But other private employers have to make a different calculus, their own cost benefit analysis based on their workforce, their retention, their attractiveness to workers, and so forth, and what makes the most sense for them.
So you would agree that the process, this bill hasn't gone through an appropriate process to be able to determine the costs and the effects on production and the consequences. What's your biggest concern with this bill?
Well, my biggest concern with the bill, and more so the hearing and the way that this issue is being presented, is, you know, I would be careful not to misconstrue public support for the concept of paid leave and support for a particular policy, especially without a full examination of the trade-offs and downsides associated with that proposal. So, for example, the Family Act, which is the leading proposal to establish a national comprehensive paid leave entitlement, comes with a very significant downside, and I appreciate lawmakers' concern about low-income workers, but it would establish a regressive payroll tax that would cost low-income workers and families. And those are the folks who are least likely to benefit from programs like this one, as we've seen demonstrated in several of the states that have experimented with programs like this, and several countries abroad have experimented with programs like this. It's a regressive policy that redistributes wealth from low-income people to upper and middle-income families.
I agree completely. Thank you for your comments. I want to thank all the witnesses for being here. And I want to add to that, inflation is a regressive tax, and the policies of this administration are creating inflation, which is a tax on low income and poor families. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Madam Chair, may I speak to something I just heard?
Yes, please pause. Just to hang on one second, please, Mr.
No
Kelly.
problem. No problem, yes.
I'm sorry, Mr. Kelly. I'm going to move on to Mr. Sarbanes, the gentleman from Maryland, and hopefully you'll have a chance to speak again later in the hearing. Mr. Sarbanes, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair. Actually, I'm going to be asking Mr. Kelly a question, so he may want to take a chance to offer his thoughts that he has. I'm hitting some of the high points that have already been covered, but I think it's important. So again, in 2020, we know that Congress passed the bipartisan, I emphasize that, Bipartisan Families First Coronavirus Response Act, the FFCRA, which had two major provisions related to paid leave, as we know. The first provided 12 weeks of partially compensated family and medical leave for coronavirus-related caregiving reasons, including for childcare when schools or daycare centers were closed due to the pandemic. The second provision provided up to 2 weeks of paid sick leave for reasons related to the pandemic. The FFCRA also included tax credits. This was very important for employers to help them cover costs for this paid leave. And then in March of 2021, when we passed the American Rescue Plan, it extended the tax credits to businesses, also provided additional paid family and medical leave for federal employees for coronavirus-related reasons. Mr. Kelly, many federal employees, including your members, have been on the front lines of the government's response to the pandemic, of course. This includes many essential workers who continue to work on site throughout the pandemic. How have the federal government's coronavirus leave policies helped federal employees take care of themselves and their families while at the same time serving their nation?
Well, you know, and that's a good question, and I appreciate it too. But the passing of these bills has helped tremendously, okay? Because a person don't have to worry about the stress of going to job and the possibility of being contracted with this virus, but they are still able to, you know, perform for the American people, you know, and so it's very important that this bill was passed, okay? But I want to just say that this is about, you know, emergency situations. I also want to reiterate the fact that, you know, the VA never stopped working. That's what I wanted to comment on earlier, if I may. The VA never stopped working. Telework is working from home, not working at all, but it's working from home. And a matter of fact, production went up. Telework and paid leave made it possible to keep things going, okay? And that's the point that I wanted to make earlier, and it's just in line with the question that you asked.
Well, actually, I appreciate you mentioning telework just because I've worked on that issue for many, many years. Proud of the Telework Improvement Act that we passed here in Congress, was signed into law a few years back, which really upgraded the telework policies across the federal government in a way that did, as you say, contribute to productivity in very measurable ways. And I assume that the policies we put in place that we're discussing today that helped federal workers during the pandemic were also really critical in terms of keeping the employee morale high, or at least not taking a huge hit at a time when people were feeling a lot of stress. So that's one of the reasons it's so important. Ms. Szabo, I wanted to get your views on the effect that these leave provisions in the FFCRA and the American Rescue Plan have on the private sector. In other words, what role did they play in helping workers and businesses weather the pandemic?
That's a great question. Thank you so much. You know, the FFCRA put in place for the first time ever paid sick leave and paid childcare leave that was required of certain businesses and available to certain employees. It's estimated to have prevented 15 million COVID cases per day nationwide at the height of the pandemic. businesses were able to get tax credits to reimburse them for the leave that they were required to provide. In December, the requirement went away. The tax credits remain, which is great for businesses that take them. But this is leaving behind millions of workers. And it's why we can't ever go back to a situation where workers don't have access to paid leave and where the private sector doesn't have the support that it needs in guaranteeing access to paid leave. And that's why a policy like the Family Act or the American Families Plan or the NEAL Building an Economy for Families Act is so critical, because it will put in place the stability that businesses and workers need going forward for public health emergencies like COVID and for individual family situations and emergencies in perpetuity. The private sector, I think, during COVID saw that government could provide support for paid leave, and businesses like Eric's here benefited from it.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair. I yield back.
The chair now recognizes Ms. Spear, the gentlelady from California.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Let me just start off by commenting on what my good colleague, Mr. Comer, said. He hasn't ever had a baby, so maybe he thinks it's a vacation. But for those of us who have been moms, who have given birth to children, it's no vacation. It is stressful, it is challenging, and his comment is truly insulting to every mother in this country. Secondly, I think we have lost sight of what this is all about. This is about creating a national program where both the employee and the employee will contribute so that there will be the opportunity for paid leave for employees. Now, we already know that only 19% of the employees in this country have paid leave. And for those that are concerned that this is somehow going to impact poor people, well, poor people have even less opportunity for paid family leave now. It's like 8%. So, we are the only industrialized country in the world that has this caveman attitude about parental leave. And we've got to grow up. We've got to recognize that it takes a 2-income family to make it in this country today. And we've got to make it easier on both parents. And I'm just going to speak about one bill in particular and ask for some commentary on it. Believe it or not, our service members do not have the same parental leave benefits that our federal employees have. And I guess the question I have is, are my Republican colleagues willing to support a bipartisan bill co-authored by Congresswoman Bice and Congressman Joyce to equalize that for the men and women in our country who will put their lives on the line, but whose parental leave is less than what it is for federal employees? Let me start with Ms. Chabot. Why do you think these kind of benefits are important for all, but particularly for service members?
Well, reams of research show the importance of gender equal parental leave in terms of maternal health, child outcomes, father's engagement. For service members, if we are serious about creating a diverse and inclusive military, we have to ensure equitable parental leave. This means that male service members will be able to take care of their new children at equal levels. It will make the federal, military service, again, competitive. It will help ensure that as young people who enter the military make decisions about whether to stay, it will make them more likely to stay. I actually had a law student working with me. He and his wife actually both left the military as they were thinking about having children because of the inequitable paid leave and the lack of paid leave for dads. So this is an issue for military readiness and competitiveness. And more than that, we also need to destigmatize caregiving that is so often falling on women and holding women behind, including in the military. So for all those reasons, I think that bill is really important, and creating equity between the genders in military service for parental leave is critically important.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly, you're an Army veteran and former Army civilian employee. And I think you're also aware of the challenges for our families of the Reserve and National Guard. And they have no comprehensive paid leave policies to support these military families. Can you comment on the burdens and stress associated with that?
Yeah, I think the burden and the stresses is the same as anyone else, right? And we've heard throughout the day of how it's a burden on any family member, right? That doesn't have the paid leave. I mean, the fact that if you are, not able to spend time with your family, your newborn baby or whatever, it stresses, right? It's just stress all around. So I think the impact for the military is the same impact that you have for anyone else. So I think it's a benefit that everyone should be able to share.
Thank you. And let me just close by saying, at one point in my congressional office, I had two of my staff members out on parental leave, my chief of staff and one of my ledge staff for 3 months. And the sky didn't fall. We were able to conduct business, do the job, and it was a great benefit to them, and they were very grateful for it. So if we are truly a country that supports family values, it's time to show it. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Kelly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle argue that federal employee benefits are already generous and that federal employees don't need another leave benefit. I'd like to remind my colleagues about the 35-day long government shutdown from December 22nd, 2018 to January 25th, 2019. During that time, 800,000 federal employees were either on furlough or were working without pay. More than 60% of those workers reported exhausting their savings during the shutdown, which tracks with the 63% of Americans who don't have enough savings to cover a $500 emergency. Federal workers endure the same hardships and financial insecurities as many of their fellow Americans. Mr. Kelly, can you tell us about what kind of financial hardships federal employees have endured during the 2019 shutdown, the pandemic, or even over the course of their careers?
Again, that is so a great question. Think about and you heard me reference TSA quite a bit, right? Think about the fact that this TSA workforce averaged about $35,000 a year, okay? And not getting paid, but still having to travel back and forth to work in a metropolitan area like New York City, like Washington, D.C., okay? They have to go back and forth to work, they have to take care of childcare and all these types of things, and they're not getting a paycheck. Some of them lost their homes, right? Some of them couldn't get back and forth to the doctor. It was all kind of crisis coming up, and that's just with the TSA workforce. But throughout America, there was all kind of employees that were being affected, because like you said, $500 is a lot to a lot of people. And they couldn't come up with it, right? It wasn't getting paid, and they couldn't come up with house note. They couldn't come up with car note. And many of them lost their home, lost automobiles, and those types of things. Sure, we were able to go back and rectify, what could happen in the future, but it didn't help the fact that many of those employees lost their homes. Many of them, lost their minds, if you will. And that's not fair to the American workforce.
And thank you for that. While the federal workforce falls within this community's jurisdiction, I support comprehensive paid family and medical leave for all workers. Ms. Sabo, can you explain to us why paid family and medical leave is not some superfluous perk, but an essential requirement for the health and prosperity of American workers and businesses?
Absolutely, Representative Kelly, thank you. Paid leave is essential for all of us because at one time or another, every single working person is going to need to take time to care for themselves, to care for a loved one, or to welcome a child into their family. And yet now just 1 in 5 workers and just 5% of lower wage workers have access to paid family leave. This means families are losing on average $1,000 a year. Families in the aggregate are losing $22.5 billion a year. Businesses are incurring costs up to 200% of the cost of turnover when workers leave. And the economy itself is losing out. $500 billion a year is estimated that paid leave, lack of paid leave contributes to from before the pandemic. On the flip side, McKinsey estimates that the GDP of the US could grow by $2.4 trillion if we address gender inequities, and paid family and medical leave is a big part of it.
Thank you so much. And I yield back the balance of my time to thank both of you so much.
The gentlelady yields back, and the gentlewoman from the great state of Massachusetts. Mrs. Presley is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. All I can think about as I've been sitting here is, there but for the grace of God, go I. Many of my colleagues today have really proved that our greatest deficit as a nation is not one of resource, but of empathy. Our greatest wealth as a nation is the health of our people. And a meaningful, universal, and permanent paid leave policy is about the health of our people, about the stabilization of our families. So many of your opinions fly in the face of what you often characterize is your promotion of family values. This really flies in the face of that. And furthermore proves that you value people's labor in the traditional sense more than you do their very lives. As someone who had the honor of being a caregiver to my mother in the final weeks of her life as she valiantly battled leukemia, although I was away from work, I was certainly not off. It requires great emotional and physical labor, and there's no place else in the world that I would have rather been to support my mother in her transition. Your comments not only dishonor parents, people who've grown their family through adoption, but the millions of caregivers who in this moment feel alone and unseen, you've just contributed to that hurt. But let me get to my questions. Ms. Bigelow, there has been a long and inaccurate assumption that people with disabilities are only the recipients of care and not the providers of care. When the reality is that people with disabilities play both roles and often face barriers to benefits and services as a result. Can you elaborate on the importance of centering people with disabilities in any effort to advance universal paid family and medical leave?
Yes, thank you, Congresswoman, for this question. It's a really important point to make. People with disabilities are a valuable part of our communities and our workforce. A disability inclusive paid leave program can help support people with disabilities to more fully participate in the economy and have economic independence. A recent analysis of FMLA data found that nearly 16% of workers who took any leave in the past 12 months may have done so for a disability. And nearly 1/3 of those workers with a disability also had at least one child under 18. So it's important to remember that workers with disability already have lower incomes, meaning they are less likely to have savings to rely on. So centering them in the paid family and medical leave policy will really help bring a financial lifeline to them, which is part of their economic stability.
Thank you. And as I transition, I wanted to ask the chair if I could enter a report into the record. The report is titled Paid Leave is Essential for Healthy Moms and Babies. It's by the National Partnership in collaboration with the National Birth Equity Collaborative.
Without objection.
All right. So we've spoken about the disability justice part of this that is often overlooked. I wanted to talk about pregnancy loss, which is also often overlooked in other health events. 3 out of 4 people who take paid leave do so for reasons outside of maternity or parental care. Ms. Bigelow, why is it important to establish a national paid leave program that supports a diverse array of care needs?
Well, like you said, the majority of people need time off to care for a family member's serious health issue or their own. And this is for things like cancer treatment, to help an aging parent recover from a fall, or to be with a child in the hospital. Comprehensive paid leave improves health outcomes for those who need care and prevents people from having to make impossible choices between being there for their families and their own health and their jobs and income. It's also important for gender equity because women are more likely to take parental leave. A policy that only covers new parents could reinforce gender discrimination. So finally, as a population in the workforce that are both aging, a comprehensive paid leave policy is just smart economics to ensure older workers can continue working and can manage work with caring for an aging parent or loved one.
Thank you. And Ms. Szabo, what are some of the policies I want to talk about, those that are receiving SSI and SSDI? What are some of the policies, Ms. Szabo, that this committee should be considering when it comes to ensuring that a paid family medical leave program is inclusive for individuals who work and receive supplemental security income?
Ayanna, your time has expired, but Ms. Szabo, you may respond to the gentle lady's question.
I'll be brief. Thank you for the question. I think we need to ensure that any new programs we put in place are not taking away rights to other programs for people who are working. So somebody who is on SSI or has a partial disability but is working part-time and then needs to take leave must have that portion of their wages replaced and not be barred from accessing either of those benefits because of the receipt of the other. The point here is to pull low-income people and people who are living paycheck to paycheck, just barely, up to the level where they're going to be able to continue to pay their bills and make ends meet and have security for themselves. This is about stabilization, financial independence, and well-being.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from the great state of Michigan, Ms. Lawrence, you are now recognized.
Thank you so much. I want to thank the panel for being here. I'm so happy we're having this discussion. I just want for the record again to reflect that I spent 30 years working for a federal agency and nothing has changed now that I'm in Congress. I'm a mother, I was a daughter, I am a daughter, I have family. Just like as a member of Congress, if any of us have a family emergency or we have a crisis, we are paid leave to be able to care for our families. Federal workers should not be exempt from that. And some of the privileged conversations I'm hearing is really heartbreaking. I am co-chair of the Women's Caucus, but one of the issues I want to emphasize, while we talk about the impact of women and pregnancy and being the #1 caregiver in almost every family, this is a family issue. I had a town hall where a man said, Congresswoman, I will have no vacation. I've used all my vacation time to care for my children during this pandemic. And so I want the sensitivity of this body to think about human beings who are our federal workers, who show up every day to do the work, who have worked as frontliners during this pandemic. Ms. Szabo, would access to paid leave help women maintain the workforce participation? Now we are struggling with this disappearance of women in the workforce. Can you please talk to that?
Absolutely. I think COVID brought into sharp relief the invisible caregiving that is happening. Women bear a disproportionate share of that caregiving, but one of the reasons we need gender equal leave is both to recognize the caregiving as it's happening today and encourage a more equitable division going forward. Something that's really struck me recently is a survey finding from Bipartisan Policy Center and Morning Consult, which found that 38% of currently unemployed workers, I think as of April, said that they'd be more likely to return to work sooner if their next employer provided paid family leave. And that was particularly true of unemployed parents, nearly half of whom said it would help them return to work sooner. So this idea that providing paid leave keeps people out of work is exactly backwards. People need access to paid leave to know that they can show up, they can do their best work, and that they're going to be able to take the time that they need and then come back if they do need to take time for a caregiving need. And that's particularly true in this survey of Black workers and Latinx workers who cited caregiving as a reason that they had to leave the workforce compared to white workers.
I appreciate that. And the other issue that we as members of Congress should understand, the fact that the emergency leave, if my child is sick, a lot of caregiving facilities will say, if your child has a sniffle or a cold, don't bring them in, you keep them at home and take care of that child. I know for a fact that there are women who, if they had the ability to take leave, would maintain their employment. But because they don't, and because of childcare, and this is on another platform that we must provide as a country, the sensitivity to the need for childcare in America. The last question is to Ms. Kelly. The temporary paid leave measures for federal employees help members. I know that. But do you believe that federal employees who now have guaranteed paid parental leave have been able to take advantage of this temporary emergency paid leave? Demonstrates that we need to make this permanent.
Did you say Ms. Kelly or Mr. Kelly?
Mr. Kelly, I'm sorry.
Okay. All right. So I certainly think that, it demonstrates that we need to make this permanent because, we've heard more than, I don't know how many stories I've heard of how much has been a benefit to have temporary paid leave, right? And so it tells us that if we were to make it permanent, then morale is definitely going to be boosted because employees are happy for the measures that the lawmakers took and considered them, considered their well-being, considered their family, and all those things. It meant so much to them. And to put something permanently in place for that, I think would only send the right message.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. And forgive me for using the wrong title.
It's okay.
I just want to say to everyone, federal employees are the backbones of this country. And when I hear discussions about them getting too much, you don't say that when they give everything to keep this country running, our democracy, our government, our services that we provide that makes us America. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. She yields back. And the gentleman from the great state of California, Mr. DeSaulnier, is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for having this hearing. Thank you for the leadership on this subject. And thank you for the manner that this hearing is being held. I wanted to talk about the impact on regional economies and small businesses. As a former small business owner, Mr. Sorkin and Ms. Szabo, if you could comment on this challenge of that 70% of small business owners want to provide these kind of benefits, but only 15% are. So I also come from a region in San Francisco Bay Area where the state of California, local government in Northern California, and large private employers really were at the forefront of this. So we've had enough time to start to see that some of the benefits accrue to small businesses. As someone like myself, who is a retailer, there's more disposable income out in our economy that also benefits. So this conundrum of doing what small business wants to do, according to surveys, but the challenges they have vis-a-vis cash flow, maybe you could comment on that, Mr. Sorkin, in your own personal experience, and Ms. Szabo, if you could follow up with any thoughts you have.
Sure. Thank you, Congressman. I don't know any employees or any workers who don't want paid family and medical leave. It really comes down to the ability of small businesses to afford it, particularly in the smallest businesses and in startups. Cash flow can be a real headwind to getting that done. So having federal support for that is just a game changer. It's as simple as that to me. It's really, in my mind, it's a no-brainer. I know a ton of businesses who would really appreciate the federal support.
Szabo, any observations?
Absolutely. I mean, I think what is really exciting is that we now have 7 jurisdictions that have paid family and medical leave programs in place and functioning. And in the 4 that have been functioning the longest, there are studies in each one of those that shows that businesses, and particularly small businesses, have benefited. They've benefited in terms of productivity. They haven't seen any negative impacts. More than a majority of small business owners in each of those jurisdictions support the programs that are in place. It's improved retention. It's improved, in just a study that was done in New York recently, their ability to navigate long leaves. I really commend Mr. Sorkin for providing what his employees need on a one-to-one basis. But the reality is that many of his peer companies don't do that, can't do that, even if they want to do that. And that is the reason that we need a national program. Far from the talking points by opponents, this isn't about increasing costs. It's not about diminishing flexibility. It's about ensuring that every worker can take the time that they need to care for themselves or a loved one, have their employees be more likely to come back to work. And we just don't see any of the negative impacts that doubters like to say will occur. We just don't. Each state has figured out how to deal with it, and San Francisco is a great example of that.
Thank you. Ms. Bigelow, your organization has done some research on attracting and retaining workforce. Again, my experience in the restaurant business in a high cost area, being able to retain employees, I wanted to be able to pay them enough and also provide them with these kind of benefits. So your research indicates that providing for this helps small businesses. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yes, I think that that's true because just like we've heard from Mr. Sorkin here, it's very hard to do this on your own. And what we've learned from these state programs is that this is a really great equalizer for small businesses to compete with the larger companies like in your district that already offer it, a lot of the tech companies. And this is really a core reason why we are fighting for paid leave for all, not because all businesses should be able to provide this and all people should be able to have it no matter where you work.
Madam Chair, I want to thank all the witnesses. I want to thank you again. There is a challenge here, and it's a short-term versus, I would say, medium-term. In our experience here in Northern California, there were pressures, particularly on small businesses that had small rate of return, like the businesses I were in. So you tend to hunker down and say, I just want to make my next payroll. But in the very near term, I think within a year or two, you could see the benefits. And lastly, Madam Chair, just personally, I am reminded today of wisdom from my Irish mother, who used to tell myself and my three brothers, weak men attack strong women. So thank you for your leadership.
Wow. The gentleman from California, the great state of California, Vice Chair Gomez is recognized. Representative Gomez. There. Mr. Gomez, you are now recognized.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman Maloney, for having another hearing on paid family leave. This is something that is extremely important. I don't know why I'm on two screens at once, but you guys get to get double of me. But first, let me just say, I know my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are starting to ask why this is even necessary, right? This paid family leave. And they made so much progress during the last administration when they stopped arguing about if it's needed, and they started arguing about how to get it done. But I felt like they backtracked a little bit. So let's bring them back to the forefront of the fact that universal paid leave is just critical to protecting all Americans. I think the fact is no longer up for debate. I think it's particularly true. We've seen it time and time again, and we saw the pandemic show that it's absolutely needed. I'm proud that in California, I led one of the largest expansions of paid family leave when I was a state assembly member, made the wage replacement more progressive in the fact that lower income individuals would get a higher wage replacement so that they can actually afford to take time off. And the fact that we expanded it to include not just parental leave, but also how do you take care of a sick family member? How do you actually go and make sure that they have the time off to be there during their last days? And I think if we care about the family, we have to care about the ability of these individuals to be there in the toughest of circumstances and not worry if they're going to have a job when they return or not. So I want just to get to some questions. Ms. Chabot, can you describe how a comprehensive national paid leave policy can advance racial and gender equity? And the reason why I'm asking that is the fact that we know that a lot of working class folks tend to be minority, tend to be work in a lot of industries that are just part-time, and and it's not that they don't work. They often work 4 or 5 jobs a week to make ends meet, but then they don't have the kind of leave that's necessary to be able to take time off. Like my parents, when I got sick with pneumonia when I was 7, my parents had to like miss shifts from work, and they're working all the time. And it was something that still sits with me to this day. So Ms. Szabo, that was a question for you.
That's great. Thank you for bringing this up. And your story, you tell your story so eloquently, and it sticks with me because it is the experience of so many other families and kids who spend more time in the hospital because they don't have a parent there to care for them, to be able to talk to doctors and make sure that the care that they need, that their child needs, is going to be able to be continued when they get home. But to answer your question, we've learned a lot from the state paid leave programs. We've learned that wage replacement that's higher for low wage workers is critically important to ensure that lower wage workers are able to take the benefit that's provided. We know that employment protections are critically important so that the 44% of workers who are not covered by the Family and Medical Leave Act are able to take the benefit that they have without fear of losing their job. We know that the ability of people to care for more than just parents, spouses, and children is critically important. And that's why Chairwoman Maloney's FMLA expansion bill that she's been working on for a number of years is so critical, and why the inclusive family definition in both the NEAL Building an Economy for Families proposal and the American Families Plan is so important, as states have all recognized. Importantly, I want to come back to something that Ms. Manning said earlier about the ways in which lower wage workers may not be served by paid leave. I think we've learned a lot from how state programs have been constructed. And that gives us a tremendous opportunity when Congress does implement a federal program to correct some of the challenges and to ensure that all workers, whether they are lower wage workers or middle wage workers, are able to take the paid family and medical leave that they need, and then come back to work, to be back at businesses like Mr. Sorkin's, to be back at employers, that we talk to all across the country, 70% of whom want access to paid leave, according to many national surveys of small businesses.
And great, and it's true. Some folks are saying that we don't learn from how these programs are implemented. No, we've learned a lot. Wage replacement is key. Job protection is key. And then just knowing about the programs is key. And if we can do that, we can help people across the board. And the federal government, because we have the ability, should play an active role in structuring a program that can be a model that Chairwoman Maloney has led on. And I think that will help people think about it in a different way. So I think we're moving in the right direction. We got to keep going. And I'm glad Chairwoman Maloney has been leading this fight. So with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and that concludes the questioners. And I just want to thank all of my colleagues and all the panelists. You really did a wonderful job today answering the questions and sharing your expertise with us. But before I close, I want to offer the ranking member an opportunity to offer any closing remarks he may have. Ranking Member Comer, you are now recognized.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. And again, thank the witnesses for being here today. Again, Madam Chair, this is the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, and we certainly have no shortage of oversight opportunities. I'm going to conclude by once again requesting that this committee meet in person and hold hearings on the border crisis and or the origination of COVID-19 and or committee hearing on the problems with the excessive fraud in the unemployment system, specifically California. So I think those would be 3 really good committee hearings. We know that we can work in a bipartisan way because we passed bipartisan postal reform out of the House Oversight Committee. But again, we just feel like when we're talking about workers right now, there's a shortage of workers in America, and the employers are pleading with the government to get out of the way and stop paying people not to work. And I just, to have this committee hearing at a time when our economy can't rebound because there's a labor shortage, 8 million jobs posted in America right now. We just feel like there were better opportunities for committee hearings moving forward. So Madam Chair, I yield back the balance of my time and hope that we can have some good committee hearings that the taxpayers of America want to see this committee work on. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize myself. If we've learned one thing today, it is that paid leave is not, as my Republican colleagues claimed, a perk, end quote. Workers need paid leave to recover from serious illnesses, to take care of sick children, and to deal with the sudden military deployment of a family member. Having a seriously ill child is not a perk. Taking time to deal with active duty deployment is not a perk. As our nation seeks to recover from the pandemic, permanent, comprehensive paid leave is essential to support workers and the families who depend on them. Not surprisingly, the vast majority of Americans, including most Republicans, support paid leave. But it is not only workers and their families who gain from paid leave. Employers, including the federal government and the private sector, also benefit from a healthier, motivated workforce. That is why paid leave is supported by a growing number of small and large businesses. Ensuring comprehensive paid leave for federal workers through HR 564 would help lead the way for comprehensive paid family and medical leave for all American workers. I look forward to continuing to move this bill forward in our committee. Before I close, I'd like to submit the following statements and letters for the record. A statement in support for HR 564 from Tony Reardon, President of the National Treasury Employee Union. A statement of support from Karen Rainey, President of Federally Employed Women. A statement of support from Jenna Johnson, the head of Patagonia, Inc. A statement of support from the National Air Traffic Controllers Association, and a letter for HR 564 from the Government Managers Coalition. In closing, I want to thank our panelists for their remarks, and I want to commend my colleagues for participating in this important conversation. With that, and without objection, all members have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials and to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. This hearing is adjourned.